You do not need a uniform, a badge, or a title to feel powerful. Sometimes all it takes is permission, a quiet room, a role handed to you by someone you trust. That is what makes this experiment so unsettling. Because nothing about it started with cruelty. It started with curiosity, and it ended with people discovering something about themselves they never wanted to see. Before we continue, a quick note. Many of you watch our videos, but haven't subscribed yet, so please subscribe to our channel Restwise and join our growing community. We'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to see how connected we all are. If you enjoy relaxing with philosophy, psychology, and science while drifting into sleep, give this video a like and stay with us on the journey. Now, let's get back to the video. In the early 1970s, a group of healthy college students volunteered for what they thought would be a simple psychology study. 2 weeks, good pay, no physical harm. They were randomly assigned roles. Some would be prisoners, some would be guards. A mock prison was built in the basement of a university building. Cameras were installed. The rules were clear. This was supposed to be safe, controlled, educational, and within days it became something else entirely. The guards were not trained professionals. They were ordinary young men. No history of violence, no criminal records. But once they were given authority and uniforms and nightsticks and mirrored sunglasses, something shifted. They began enforcing rules that did not exist. They invented punishments. They humiliated the prisoners, not because they were told to, but because they could, and because no one stopped them. The prisoners changed too. Some became withdrawn. Some broke down crying. One had a stress-induced emotional collapse so severe he had to be released early. These were not actors. They were not pretending. Their bodies reacted as if the danger was real. Cortisol levels rose. Sleep disappeared. Identity blurred. They stopped seeing themselves as students and started seeing themselves as inmates. Numbers instead of names. Heads down. Voices quiet. What makes this experiment terrifying is not that people were cruel. It is how fast it happened. Within 6 days, the study had to be shut down. Not because of physical violence, but because everyone involved had lost perspective. Even the researchers. Especially the researchers. The man running the experiment had become the prison superintendent in his own mind. He did not see abuse. He saw efficiency. It took an outsider walking in and saying this is wrong for him to realize how deep he was in it. This is where the illusion of power comes in. Power does not just change how you treat others. It changes how you see reality. Psychologists call this de-individuation. When people stop seeing themselves and others as individuals and start seeing roles instead. Guard, prisoner, authority, subject. Once that happens, empathy fades. Responsibility feels distant. Actions feel justified because they serve the role, not the human. There is also something called moral disengagement. That is the mental process where people convince themselves that harm is acceptable because it is necessary, deserved, or ordered. In the experiment, guards told themselves the prisoners needed discipline. Prisoners told themselves they deserved punishment for breaking rules. Everyone had a story that made the suffering feel logical, and logic can be more dangerous than anger. If this feels uncomfortable, it should, because the experiment was not revealing something rare. It was revealing something common. The same mechanisms show up in workplaces, in schools, in relationships. A manager who humiliates employees because it builds character. A teacher who shames students to maintain control. A partner who dominates because they believe they know best. Power does not have to be extreme to be corrosive. It just has to go unquestioned. You might be thinking you would never act like that. Most people do. Every guard in that study would have said the same thing before it started. That is the trap. We imagine cruelty as something loud and obvious. But most of the time, it is quiet. It sounds like following rules, doing your job, keeping order. The experiment shows how easily good intentions can turn into harmful behavior when power is involved and accountability disappears. What lingers after hearing this is not fear of others. It is fear of ourselves. The idea that in the right environment, with the right incentives, any of us could slide into a role that disconnects us from empathy. That is why this study is still talked about decades later. Not because it was extreme, but because it was ordinary. And here is the part that keeps people awake at night. The experiment did not reveal who was evil. It revealed how thin the line is between who we think we are and who we become when given control. Power feels like clarity, like certainty, like purpose. But sometimes it is just a mirror that distorts everything around it. As you sit with that thought, notice how quiet it gets, how the room feels a little heavier. Because once you see how easily roles reshape behavior, it is hard to unsee. And the next time you find yourself in a position of authority or submission, you might wonder how much of what you feel is truly you and how much is the illusion speaking for you. The Milgram obedience study. When authority overrides morality, there is a moment when a voice inside you says this feels wrong. Most of us like to believe that voice always wins, that when it really matters, morality takes over, and we choose to stop. The Milgram obedience study exists because that belief needed to be tested. And what it revealed was not comfortable. It was quiet, polite, almost boring. And that is exactly why it is so disturbing. The experiment was simple on the surface. Ordinary people were invited into a lab and told they were participating in a study about learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher. Another person played the role of learner and was placed in a separate room. The teacher was instructed to administer electric shocks every time the learner gave a wrong answer. The shocks increased in intensity with each mistake. The teacher did not know the shocks were fake. The learner did not know the teacher was not really trying to hurt them, and the man in the lab coat calmly said, "Please continue." At first, it was easy. A mild shock, a small mistake. But as the voltage increased, the learner began to react. He complained of pain. He begged to stop. He screamed. Eventually, he went silent, and still, the experimenter stood there, expression neutral, repeating simple phrases like, "The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. Please go on." Here is the shock. About 65% of participants continued all the way to the highest voltage. What they believed was potentially lethal. These were not sadists. They were teachers, salesmen, parents, regular people who showed visible signs of distress: sweating, shaking, nervous laughter. Some protested verbally, some begged to stop, and then they pressed the button anyway. This is where the study cuts deep. The participants were not following orders because they wanted to hurt someone. They were following orders because the authority figure told them it was necessary. Psychologically, this taps into something called agentic state. It is when people stop seeing themselves as responsible actors and start seeing themselves as instruments carrying out someone else's wishes. Responsibility shifts upward. If something goes wrong, it feels like it belongs to the authority, not you. Your brain loves this shift. Responsibility is heavy. Letting go of it feels like relief. When an authority figure speaks with confidence and legitimacy, like a scientist in a lab coat, your brain assumes they know something you do not. That assumption can override your moral compass without you realizing it. Not because you are weak, but because you are human. It is important to understand that most participants did question the experiment. They asked if the learner was okay. They expressed concern. They showed empathy. But each time, the authority reassured them that everything was under control. That reassurance mattered more than the screaming. This is how authority overrides morality. Not through force. Through calm insistence. Through structure. Through the illusion that someone else has already done the moral math for you. If this still feels distant, bring it closer. Think about workplaces where employees follow unethical instructions because a manager said so. Medical professionals pressured into procedures they are uncomfortable with because a senior doctor insists. Soldiers trained to obey commands even when they conflict with personal values. The Milgram study is not about electric shocks. It is about obedience as a default setting. There is also the power of incremental escalation. The shocks did not start high. They increased gradually. This matters because each small step makes the next one easier. Psychologists call this the foot in the door effect. Once you agree to something minor, it becomes psychologically harder to refuse the next request. By the time the situation feels extreme, you are already committed. Stopping would mean admitting that the earlier choices were wrong, and that is painful. What makes this study haunting is that participants were not unaware of the harm. They knew, they felt it, their bodies reacted, and still they continued. That tells us something important. Moral awareness alone is not always enough to stop harmful behavior. Context matters. Authority matters. Structure matters. And when those forces align, they can drown out even strong internal resistance. After the experiment, participants were told the truth. Many were shocked by their own behavior. Some cried. Some laughed nervously. Some said they would never have believed they were capable of going that far. That reaction might be the most unsettling part, because it means the danger is not obvious from the inside. You do not feel like a villain when it is happening. You feel like someone trying to do the right thing under pressure. So what stays with you is not the image of the shock machine. It is the realization that morality is not a fixed trait. It is a fragile process that depends on environment, authority, and the stories we tell ourselves about responsibility. The Milgram study does not ask why people obey. It asks what it takes to disobey. And the answer is more than good intentions. As this thought settles, notice how quiet it becomes. Because once you understand how easily authority can override conscience, you start seeing it everywhere. And you might find yourself wondering, in the moment when someone confident tells you to continue, how loud your inner voice will really be. The little Albert experiment and the creation of fear. Fear does not usually arrive fully formed. It is built quietly, moment by moment, often without us realizing it is happening. One day you are fine. The next, your chest tightens at the sight of something that never hurt you before. You do not remember choosing that fear. That is what makes this experiment so unsettling. It shows how easily fear can be created, and how little control we sometimes have over what our minds learn to avoid. In the early 1920s, a baby known as Little Albert was brought into a lab. He was healthy, calm, and curious. Researchers showed him different objects: a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, cotton, even a monkey. Albert showed no fear. He reached out, he smiled. There was nothing threatening about any of it. That baseline mattered, because what happened next would change how his brain responded to the world. Every time Albert touched the white rat, the researchers made a sudden loud noise by striking a steel bar behind his head. The sound was sharp and startling. Albert cried. His body tensed. His nervous system reacted exactly as you would expect. Noise equals danger. After several pairings, something shifted. The rat no longer needed the noise. Albert began crying at the sight of the rat alone. His fear had been learned. This is classical conditioning in its rawest form. The brain takes a neutral stimulus and links it to something frightening. Over time, the neutral thing becomes frightening too. Ivan Pavlov demonstrated this with dogs and bells. The little Albert experiment showed it in a human child, and the implications were chilling. Fear does not require logic. It requires association. The shock comes when you realize the fear did not stop with the rat. Albert began reacting the same way to other white and furry objects. A rabbit, a dog, even a Santa Claus mask with a white beard. His brain had generalized the fear. It was no longer specific. Anything that resembled the original trigger could set off the same response. That is how phobias spread. One experience teaches the brain to be on guard everywhere. What makes this harder to sit with is that Albert was never deconditioned. The researchers did not reverse the fear. They did not help him unlearn it. The experiment ended, and Albert left with a nervous system that now associated softness and whiteness with danger. We do not know how long that fear lasted. We only know that it was deliberately planted. At this point, you might feel angry. You should. But also uneasy in a quieter way. Because the experiment did not rely on cruelty in the traditional sense. There was no physical injury. No prolonged pain, just sound, timing, repetition. And the brain did the rest. That is what makes it relatable. Fear in real life is often created the same way. Think about how many fears begin with one moment. A car accident and suddenly driving feels unsafe. A harsh rejection and intimacy feels dangerous. A humiliating experience in public speaking feels like a threat. Your rational mind knows not every situation is the same. But your nervous system does not care. It learned a rule. Avoid this. Stay alert. Protect yourself. Psychologically, this happens because the amygdala learns faster than the rational brain. The amygdala is responsible for threat detection. It does not wait for evidence. It reacts based on patterns. Once it decides something is dangerous, it sends signals through your body before you can think. Heart rate increases. Muscles tense. Breathing changes. By the time logic arrives, fear is already in control. The little Albert experiment shows that fear does not need to be true to feel real. It only needs to be consistent. That is why fears can feel so frustrating. People tell you nothing bad will happen. You agree intellectually, and yet your body reacts anyway. That reaction is learned, and learning can happen without consent. What makes this experiment linger is the question it raises. If fear can be created so easily, how many of our fears were never really ours to begin with? How many were learned from parents who were anxious? From media that exaggerated danger? From single moments that got burned into memory? We like to think fear protects us. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it cages us. There is also something deeply human here. Albert trusted the environment. He did not expect harm, and that trust was used to shape his emotional response. That dynamic exists beyond labs. Children learn what to fear by watching reactions. If a parent panics, the child learns panic. If authority figures frame something as dangerous, the fear feels justified. Over time, it becomes automatic. The experiment is disturbing not just because of what it did to one child, but because of what it reveals about all of us. Fear is not always a signal of real danger. Sometimes it is a memory echoing forward, a lesson learned once and repeated forever. And as this thought settles in, it leaves behind a quiet question. If fear can be created, it can also be unlearned, but only if you recognize where it came from. The unsettling part is realizing how many fears operate in the dark, shaping behavior while pretending to be instinct. Once you see that, you start wondering which parts of your emotional world were taught to you without you ever noticing. Harlow's monkey experiments on isolation and loathe. Some lessons feel obvious only after they have already done damage, like the idea that love is optional, that comfort is a luxury, that, as long as basic needs are met, everything else will work itself out. Harlow's experiments shattered that belief in a way that still makes people uneasy decades later, not because the conclusion was surprising, but because it proved something many systems were quietly built to ignore. In the 1950s, psychologist Harry Harlow wanted to understand how attachment works. At the time, a popular belief in psychology was that love was secondary. Food mattered, warmth mattered, everything else was sentimentality. So Harlow designed an experiment using infant rhesus monkeys to test what really creates a bond. The setup sounds simple. Baby monkeys were separated from their biological mothers shortly after birth. In their place, they were given two surrogate mothers. One was made of bare wire and held a bottle of milk. The other was soft, wrapped in cloth, but provided no food. From a purely survival standpoint, the wire mother should have been the clear choice. And yet, that is not what happened. The monkeys spent most of their time clinging to the cloth mother. They went to the wire mother only briefly to eat, then immediately returned to the soft one. When frightened, they ran straight to the cloth figure, pressing their bodies into it as if it could protect them. Comfort, not food, became their anchor. That alone challenged existing theories, but the experiment went further. Some monkeys were raised with no surrogate at all. Total isolation. No touch, no affection, no interaction. What emerged from that deprivation was not neutrality, it was damage. The isolated monkeys grew up anxious, withdrawn, and socially impaired. They rocked back and forth. They clutched themselves. When introduced to other monkeys, they did not know how to interact. Some froze. Some became aggressive. Some seemed emotionally absent. This is where the weight of the experiment settles in. Love was not a bonus. It was a requirement. Without early attachment, the monkeys could not form healthy relationships later. Their nervous systems had learned that the world was unsafe and unpredictable. And once that lesson was learned, it did not easily fade. Psychologically, this ties into attachment theory. Early bonds teach the brain what to expect from relationships: safety or threat, consistency or chaos. When an infant experiences comfort in moments of stress, the brain wires itself around the idea that reaching out works. When comfort is absent, the brain adapts in other ways. It becomes hypervigilant, or it shuts down. These adaptations help in the moment, but they carry long-term costs. What makes Harlow's work especially disturbing is that the monkeys did not just suffer emotionally. Their behavior as adults showed how early isolation reshaped everything. Female monkeys raised in isolation often rejected or harmed their own offspring, not out of cruelty, but because they had never learned how to nurture. Love had not been modeled. It had not been felt. so it could not be given. This forces an uncomfortable realization. Love is learned through experience, not explanation, not instruction. Through being held when distressed, through consistent presence, through repair after discomfort. When those experiences are missing, something fundamental is altered. It is tempting to distance ourselves by saying this was about monkeys. But the parallels to humans are hard to ignore. Children raised without emotional responsiveness often struggle with trust, intimacy, and regulation later in life. Not because they want to, but because their nervous systems adapted to a world where connection did not feel reliable. There is also a quieter layer to this experiment. The cloth mother was not real. It did not respond. It did not nurture actively. And yet, it was still preferred. That tells us something important. The need for comfort is so strong that even the illusion of warmth can matter. Touch itself carries regulation. It slows the heart. It signals safety. Even when the source is artificial, the body responds. This has implications far beyond childhood. Think about how people cling to routines, objects, or even relationships that do not truly meet their needs, simply because they provide familiarity or a sense of comfort. The brain is not always looking for what is best. It is looking for what feels safe. What lingers after learning about these experiments is not just sadness for the animals involved. It is the recognition that emotional neglect leaves invisible marks. No bruises, no scars, just patterns that quietly shape behavior. Difficulty asking for help, fear of closeness, a sense that relying on others is dangerous. Harlow's work forced psychology to confront something it had minimized. That love is not soft, it is structural. It shapes the architecture of the brain. Without it, development bends in ways that are hard to reverse. As this settles in, the discomfort does not come from shock alone. It comes from recognition, from seeing how much of human behavior makes sense when viewed through the lens of unmet attachment, and from realizing that isolation is not just about being alone. It is about being unseen. The experiment ends, but the question it leaves behind does not. If connection is as essential as food, what happens in a world that treats it as optional? And what parts of ourselves are still reaching for a cloth mother, not because it nourishes us, but because it feels like the closest thing to safety we have ever known? The Asch conformity experiments and social pressure. It starts with something so small you almost miss it. A glance around the room. A pause that lasts half a second too long. That subtle moment where you wonder if everyone else sees something you do not. The Asch conformity experiments live inside that pause. Not in shouting or force, but in silence. In the weight of other people's certainty pressing gently against your own. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch brought people into what looked like a simple vision test. Participants were shown a line on a card, then shown 3 more lines, and asked which one matched the original in length. The answer was obvious. Painfully obvious. Anyone with functioning eyesight could see it. The task was designed to be easy on purpose. What the participants did not know was that everyone else in the room was part of the experiment. They were instructed to give the wrong answer out loud. One by one, they confidently chose a line that was clearly incorrect. When it came time for the real participant to answer, the room was already leaning in the wrong direction. Here is the shock. About 1/3 of the time, people went along with the group. They said the wrong answer, even though they could see it was wrong, even though their senses told them otherwise, even though nothing bad would have happened if they disagreed. No punishment, No authority figure. Just social pressure. What makes this unsettling is not that people conformed once or twice. It is how uncomfortable they were when they did not. Participants later reported anxiety, self-doubt, and a strange sense of isolation when they considered giving the correct answer alone. Some said they knew the group was wrong, but assumed they must be missing something. Others said they did not want to stand out. A few admitted they went along just to avoid being the odd one out. This is where the psychology matters. Humans are social creatures. Our brains evolved to prioritize belonging because, historically, being excluded was dangerous. The need to fit in is not superficial. It is wired deep into our nervous systems. When everyone around you agrees on something, your brain treats disagreement as a potential threat, not logical danger, social danger. There are two forces at work here. One is normative social influence. That is the desire to be liked, accepted, or at least not rejected. The other is informational social influence. That is the belief that if everyone else thinks something, they might be right, even when evidence is in front of you. Especially when evidence is in front of you, and still no one else sees it. In the Asch experiments, people did not just parrot the group mindlessly. Many experienced real perceptual doubt. Their confidence in their own senses weakened under the weight of consensus. That is the part that lingers. Social pressure does not just change what you say, it can change what you believe you see. When Asch modified the experiment so that just one other person gave the correct answer, conformity dropped dramatically. One ally was enough to restore confidence, not because the answer became clearer, but because disagreement became safer. That tells us something powerful. The presence of even quiet support can interrupt collective error. If this still feels abstract, look around your life. Fashion trends, workplace norms, online opinions. How often do people repeat ideas not because they agree, but because everyone else seems to? How often do you scroll past a comment section and feel your opinion shift simply because of numbers, likes, upvotes, consensus? The danger of conformity is not that people are foolish. It is that they are adaptive. Going along with the group often works. It keeps things smooth. It reduces friction. But when the group is wrong, that same instinct becomes a liability. History is full of examples where silence did more damage than disagreement ever could. What makes the Asch experiments quietly disturbing is how ordinary they feel. There was no pressure to perform, no threat, no reward, just people in a room answering a question. And still, the pull of the group was strong enough to override obvious truth. That suggests conformity does not require intensity. It requires presence. Participants who resisted conformity were not superhuman. They were not immune to pressure. They simply placed more trust in their own perception than in group agreement. That trust is fragile. It can be strengthened or weakened depending on environment. When dissent is punished socially, conformity rises. When dissent is normalized, truth has room to breathe. This matters because social pressure rarely announces itself. It does not say you must agree. It says everyone already does. It frames disagreement as awkward, as unnecessary, as disruptive. Over time, people learn to self-censor, not because they are afraid of being wrong, but because they are afraid of being alone. As you sit with this, notice how subtle it is, how easily certainty bends when surrounded by confidence, how quickly doubt creeps in when no one else speaks up. The Asch experiments do not warn us about crowds. They warn us about quiet rooms filled with agreement. And the unsettling question they leave behind is this: In moments where everyone else seems sure and you feel that small internal resistance, how often do you trust it? Because the line between seeing clearly and going along is thinner than we like to believe. And sometimes, all it takes to redraw reality is a room full of people pointing at the wrong answer and daring you to be the only one who does not. The Robbers' Cave Experiment: How Groups Learn to Hate. It did not begin with hatred. That is the part people miss. No one walked into this experiment angry or suspicious or looking for an enemy. It began with laughter, summer air, a camp in the woods, boys running around, swimming, joking, feeling free. And then, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment, that freedom turned into something sharp. In the 1950s, psychologist Muzafer Sherif brought a group of 11-year-old boys to a summer camp called Robbers' Cave. They were carefully selected, similar backgrounds. No behavioral issues, no history of aggression, just ordinary kids. The researchers split them into two groups and kept them separate at first. Each group bonded internally. They chose names, created rules, built identities. One group became the Eagles, the other became the Rattlers. At this stage, there was no hostility, just belonging. Then came the shift. The groups were introduced to each other through competition, tug of war, baseball, races. Only one group could win prizes. The setup was subtle but powerful. Resources were limited. Winning meant the other side lost. Almost immediately, the tone changed. Name-calling started, then insults, then sabotage. The boys burned each other's flags, raided cabins. Fights broke out. What had been playful competition hardened into something personal. This is the shock. The hatred felt real. The anger was intense, and it escalated fast. These boys were not acting. They were not told to dislike the other group. The environment did that for them. Once the groups were framed as rivals, identity fused with opposition. To be an eagle meant not being a rattler, and once identity is built on contrast, empathy collapses. Psychologically, this is called realistic conflict theory. When groups compete over limited resources, hostility becomes almost inevitable. The brain simplifies the world into us and them, in-group and out-group, good and bad. Once that line is drawn, behavior shifts to protect the group, even at the expense of fairness or kindness. What makes this experiment unsettling is how familiar it feels. The boys began exaggerating differences. Their own group was brave, smart, fair. The other group was stupid, mean, cheaters. None of this was based on reality. It was narrative. And once the narrative took hold, every action from the other side was interpreted through it. Neutral behavior felt hostile. Accidents felt intentional. Hatred fed itself. The researchers tried to reduce the conflict by bringing the groups together for fun activities. Movies, meals, shared spaces. It did not work. In some cases, it made things worse. Sitting together without a shared goal only highlighted tension. This matters because it shows something uncomfortable. Proximity alone does not heal division. Without a reason to cooperate, groups stay locked in defense mode. The turning point came when the researchers introduced superordinate goals, problems that neither group could solve alone. The camp water supply broke. Both groups had to work together to fix it. A truck got stuck and needed everyone to push. Slowly, something shifted. The boys started communicating, coordinating, depending on each other. Over time, hostility softened. Friendships crossed group lines. By the end of the camp, the boys chose to ride home together on the same bus. Here is the deeper insight. Hatred was learned, and it was unlearned the same way. Through structure, through incentives, through shared purpose. The boys did not suddenly realize the other group was human. They always knew that. What changed was the environment telling them cooperation mattered more than competition. This experiment is disturbing because it reveals how little it takes to create division. You do not need ideology. You do not need history. You do not need trauma. You need groups, labels, and a sense that one side's gain is the other side's loss. The rest fills in automatically. Think about how often this pattern shows up: politics, sports teams, online communities, workplaces. Social media turns disagreement into identity at lightning speed. Once you belong to a side, defending it feels like defending yourself. Criticism feels like attack, and empathy starts to feel like betrayal. The boys at Robber's Cave did not think they were becoming cruel. They thought they were being loyal. That is the danger. Loyalty feels moral. It feels justified, and it can make harmful behavior feel necessary. Protect the group. Win at all costs. Do not let them take what is ours. Another unsettling layer is how quickly adults lose control once group hostility ignites. The counselors struggled to contain the conflict. Punishments escalated tension. Lectures did nothing. Once hatred is framed as us versus them, authority alone cannot undo it. Only restructuring the relationship can. This experiment forces a hard truth into the open. Groups do not hate because the other side is evil. They hate because the system rewards opposition. When the world is framed as a competition, hostility becomes adaptive. It feels like survival. And here is the part that lingers when everything else fades. The boys were relieved when the conflict ended. They were tired of being angry. They enjoyed cooperating, which suggests something hopeful and unsettling at the same time. Hatred is exhausting, but it persists because environments keep feeding it. As you sit with this story, notice how quietly it mirrors the world outside. How often division feels inevitable when it is actually engineered. How easily people are taught who to fear, who to blame, who to oppose. And how rarely we question the structure that made hatred feel necessary in the first place. The Robber's Cave experiment does not just show how groups learn to hate. It shows how naturally we fall into it, and once you see that, it becomes harder to ignore the invisible hands shaping who we stand against and why. The Blue Eyes Brown Eyes classroom experiment. It happened in a classroom that looked like any other. Desks in rows, children shifting in their seats, the kind of place where you expect multiplication tables and spelling tests. Not a lesson that would follow those kids for the rest of their lives. What made this experiment so disturbing was not the setup. It was how quickly everything changed once a single idea was introduced. The day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, a teacher named Jane Elliott decided her students needed more than a lecture about equality. They were young, mostly white, kind, curious. They did not see themselves as cruel or biased. And that was exactly the point. She wanted to show them how easily prejudice is learned, not taught. She divided the class by eye color. Blue-eyed children were told they were smarter, cleaner, more trustworthy. Brown-eyed children were told the opposite. The authority in the room was absolute. This was their teacher, someone they trusted, someone who graded them. Someone who defined right and wrong every day. Within minutes, behavior shifted. The blue-eyed children sat taller. They raised their hands more. They spoke over others. They laughed when brown-eyed students struggled. The brown-eyed children became quieter. They hesitated before answering questions. Some made mistakes they never made before. A few cried. The same children, the same abilities. The only thing that changed was the story they were told about themselves. This is where the shock really lands. Test scores followed the labels. Blue-eyed students performed better academically that day. Brown-eyed students performed worse. Not because intelligence changed, but because expectation did. Psychologists call this stereotype threat and self-fulfilling prophecy. When people are told they are inferior, their cognitive load increases. Anxiety rises. Focus drops. The brain spends energy protecting the self instead of solving problems. The next day, Jane Elliott reversed the roles. Brown-eyed students were now superior. Blue-eyed students were inferior, and the same pattern repeated. Confidence shifted. Cruelty resurfaced. Performance followed status. The speed of the transformation was terrifying. Not weeks, not months, minutes. What makes this experiment so unsettling is how little resistance there was. The children did not question the system. They adapted to it. The dominant group embraced its power. The targeted group internalized its position. No one needed to be taught how to discriminate. They only needed permission. Psychologically, this taps into social identity theory. Humans derive part of their self-worth from group membership. Once groups are defined, comparison becomes automatic. In-group good, out-group bad. Even when the group distinction is meaningless, the brain treats it as real. Eye color became destiny because authority framed it that way. There is also the power of labeling. Labels simplify reality. They reduce complexity. Once a label is applied, behavior is filtered through it. A mistake by a brown-eyed child became proof of inferiority. The same mistake by a blue-eyed child was overlooked or excused. This is confirmation bias in action. We see what supports the story we already believe. What is hard to sit with is how natural the cruelty felt. The children were not monsters. They were not trying to be hurtful. They were playing the roles they were given. And those roles came with emotional rewards. Belonging, superiority, safety. The cost was paid by someone else. Adults often comfort themselves by thinking children are innocent, and prejudice is learned slowly. This experiment shows the opposite. Prejudice can be installed almost instantly when authority and structure support it. And once installed, it shapes perception at a deep level. Jane Elliott repeated this experiment with adults later. Corporate employees, college students, professionals. The results were the same: defensiveness, anger, compliance, tears. Grown adults reacted no differently than children when placed into arbitrary hierarchies. Education did not protect them. Intelligence did not protect them. Context overwhelmed character. The validation here is uncomfortable but important. If you have ever gone quiet in a room where you felt judged, if you have ever felt smaller because of how you were labeled, if you have ever watched yourself shrink under someone else's expectations, that was not weakness. That was your nervous system responding to social threat. And if you have ever felt a surge of confidence simply because you were on the winning side of a system, if you have ever dismissed someone else's struggle because it did not match your experience, that does not make you evil. It makes you human in an environment that rewards hierarchy. What lingers after learning about this experiment is the realization that discrimination does not need hatred to function. It only needs categories and power. Once those exist, behavior organizes itself. Kind people do unkind things. Capable people doubt themselves. Reality bends around expectation. The most unsettling part came at the end of the exercise. When the roles were removed, many children struggled to reconcile what they had done. Some apologized. Some were confused. Some were ashamed. The system disappeared, but the memory of how it felt did not. That is the point. Once you experience what it is like to be judged arbitrarily, you do not forget it. This experiment is not just about race or eye color. It is about how quickly we learn who matters, who speaks, who is listened to, who is trusted, and who is not. Those lessons are everywhere: classrooms, offices, online spaces. They are rarely announced, they are implied. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from recognition, from seeing how fragile fairness really is, how dependent it is on structure, and how easily good intentions are overridden by systems that sort people into better and worse. The blue eyes, brown eyes experiment does not ask whether prejudice is wrong. We already know that. It asks something more disturbing. How much of what we believe about ourselves and others was taught to us by authority, absorbed without question, and carried forward as truth? And once you start asking that, it becomes hard to look at any hierarchy the same way again. The learned helplessness experiments on dogs. At the start, the dogs did what any living thing would do. They tried. They pulled against the harness. They twisted their bodies. They searched for patterns. Their nervous systems believed effort mattered. That belief did not disappear because they were weak. It disappeared because experience taught them something brutal. Nothing they did made a difference. In the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman wanted to understand how control shapes behavior. Dogs were exposed to mild electric shocks while restrained in harnesses. The important variable was not pain, it was choice. Some dogs could stop the shock by pressing a panel. Others had no control at all. The shock came and went regardless of their actions. At first, the dogs without control reacted intensely. They barked. They struggled. They tried to escape. Over time, their behavior changed. The movement slowed. The resistance faded. Eventually, they stopped trying entirely. Their bodies learned a rule about the world. Effort does not lead to relief. Once that rule formed, motivation collapsed. Then came the part that made the experiment unforgettable. All the dogs were placed in a new environment, a box divided by a low barrier. One side delivered shocks. The other side was safe. Escaping required only a small jump. The dogs who had previously been able to control the shock jumped immediately. The dogs who had learned they were powerless stayed still. They lay down and endured the pain even though escape was easy. This is learned helplessness. When an organism is repeatedly exposed to uncontrollable stress, it learns that action is useless. That learning does not stay in the mind. It lives in the nervous system. The brain stops sending the signal to try because trying has been punished by disappointment again and again. Biologically, this response makes sense. Unpredictable and uncontrollable stress keeps the stress response active. Cortisol stays high. Over time, the brain protects itself by shutting down motivation and curiosity. Doing nothing feels safer than hoping. Passivity becomes a survival strategy, not a failure of character. This is why the experiment translates so painfully well to humans. People exposed to repeated failure or ignored effort often stop trying even when opportunities appear. Students disengage. Employees check out. People in abusive situations stop resisting. Outsiders say just leave or just try harder, without realizing the nervous system no longer believes effort works. What makes this especially unsettling is that the dogs were never incapable. The barrier was always low. The exit was always there. What disappeared was expectation. Once the brain expects pain regardless of action, it stops looking for exits. This is why depression can feel like paralysis. Not sadness alone, but a deep belief that nothing will change. Seligman later showed that learned helplessness could be reversed. When dogs were gently guided over the barrier a few times, many began escaping on their own. Their nervous systems relearned control through experience, not explanation. This detail matters. Helplessness is learned through the body, and it is unlearned the same way. If you have ever known what you should do but felt unable to move, this experiment explains why. Motivation is not willpower. It is expectation built from history. When history teaches you that effort fails, trying feels dangerous. The body shuts it down to protect you. The quiet truth at the center of this experiment is not about suffering. It is about belief. Once belief in control is lost, behavior follows. And once you understand that, it becomes harder to judge stillness as laziness. Sometimes stillness is what remains after trying has been punished too many times. The monster study Inducing Stuttering in Children. It did not look cruel at first. That is what makes this experiment so disturbing. It looked like help, like guidance, like adults doing what adults are supposed to do with children, sitting them down, speaking calmly, offering feedback, no restraints, no pain, just words. And yet, those words were enough to change how children heard themselves for years. In the late 1930s, a group of researchers wanted to understand what causes stuttering. At the time, speech disorders were poorly understood, and there was a growing belief that stuttering might not be biological at all. The idea was simple and dangerous. If you tell a child they have a speech problem, could you create one? To test this, researchers worked with children living in an orphanage. These were already vulnerable kids. Many had unstable attachments and little emotional security. Some of the children already had mild speech issues. Others spoke normally. They were divided into groups, and the experiment began. One group of children was praised constantly. They were told their speech was clear, that they were improving, that they spoke beautifully. Even the children who already stuttered were reassured and encouraged. The other group received the opposite treatment. They were told they had speech problems even if they did not. Every hesitation was pointed out. Every pause was framed as a failure. They were warned to be careful when they spoke, to think before every word, to avoid mistakes. Nothing dramatic happened right away. That is important. The damage was quiet, gradual. The children who were criticized began speaking less. They hesitated. They became anxious about opening their mouths. Some developed clear stuttering patterns where none had existed before. Others withdrew socially. They avoided reading aloud. They avoided conversations. The fear of speaking became stronger than the desire to communicate. This is the shock. The experiment did not create stuttering through physical intervention. It created it through expectation and shame. By drawing attention to normal speech variations and framing them as defects, the researchers taught the children to monitor themselves constantly. That self-monitoring disrupted natural speech flow. Anxiety tightened their muscles. Their breathing changed. Their voices followed. Psychologically, this taps into something powerful. When a child is told repeatedly that something is wrong with them, the brain adapts to that story. Especially when the message comes from authority, children depend on adults to define reality. If a trusted adult says you speak badly, the child does not argue. The child adjusts. This process is tied to performance anxiety and self-focused attention. Fluent speech requires automatic processing. When attention turns inward, when the speaker becomes hyper-aware of every sound, fluency breaks down. The more they try to control it, the worse it gets. A loop forms. Fear causes disruption. Disruption confirms fear. What makes this experiment linger is that the harm did not end when the study ended. Some of the children carried speech anxiety into adolescence. Even after being told the truth, the emotional imprint remained. Words had become dangerous. Speaking felt risky. Trust in authority had been quietly eroded. The study later became known as the monster study. Not because of what the children did, but because of what was done to them. It forced psychology to confront an uncomfortable truth. Harm does not require violence. It can be delivered through tone, through labels, through repeated suggestion. This experiment mirrors something many people recognize. Being told you are bad at math, that you are awkward, that you are difficult. Over time, those labels shape behavior, not because they are true, but because the brain works to avoid the pain of being wrong again. The safest move becomes silence or withdrawal. There is also a deeper layer here about identity. Speech is not just a skill, it is how we connect, how we express needs, how we exist socially. Undermining a child's confidence in their voice undermines their sense of presence. They learn that speaking leads to correction, not connection. The validation in this story is painful but real. If you have ever felt your throat tighten when speaking, if you have ever rehearsed sentences in your head to avoid sounding wrong, if you have ever stayed quiet because attention felt unsafe, that reaction did not come from nowhere. It was learned. The monster study shows how easily that learning can happen and how long it can last. It also shows how responsibility weighs heavier when authority is involved. The children were not experimenting, they were responding, adapting, surviving. As this settles in, the unease comes from recognizing how much power words carry, especially when spoken by those we trust, especially when spoken to children. Once you understand that identity can be shaped by repeated suggestion, it becomes impossible to hear criticism the same way again. The experiment ends on paper, but its lesson does not, because the most unsettling part is not that speech was damaged. It is that something as intimate as a voice can be reshaped by expectation alone. And once that happens, silence can feel safer than being heard. The sleep deprivation experiments on human behavior. It starts quietly, not with panic or hallucinations, but with small cracks in how the world feels. Colors seem duller. Thoughts take longer to land. You reread the same sentence and still do not know what it said. Sleep deprivation does not announce itself as danger. It disguises itself as being fine. For decades, researchers have studied what happens when humans are denied sleep. Not for days at first. Sometimes just one night, sometimes two. The reason is simple. Sleep is not rest in the casual sense. It is maintenance. And when maintenance is skipped, systems begin failing in ways that are subtle before they are severe. In controlled experiments, participants are kept awake while researchers track cognition, emotion, and behavior. After about 24 hours without sleep, reaction times slow dramatically. People become more impulsive. Attention fractures. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment and self-control, begins to underperform. This means you are still awake, but less capable of thinking clearly about what you are doing. Here is the unsettling part. Most participants insist they are functioning normally. Subjective confidence stays high while objective performance collapses. People make more mistakes, but feel just as capable. That mismatch is dangerous. It means sleep deprivation removes insight before it removes function. As deprivation continues, emotional regulation unravels. Small frustrations feel overwhelming. Neutral expressions look hostile. The amygdala, the brain's threat detector, becomes hyperactive, while the calming influence of the rational brain weakens. Fear, anger, and anxiety rise without clear cause. This is why sleep-deprived people are more reactive, more paranoid, and more likely to misinterpret social cues. In longer experiments, where participants are restricted to very little sleep over several days, something stranger happens. The brain begins taking micronaps, brief moments where parts of the brain shut down for a few seconds while the person appears awake. During these lapses, information does not register. Memory fails. Actions become automatic. The person is present, but not fully conscious. This explains why sleep deprivation has been linked to serious accidents. Drivers drift across lanes. Surgeons make errors. Soldiers misjudge threats. It is not because they do not care. It is because the brain is offline in fragments, and the person does not know it. Some of the most disturbing findings come from extreme deprivation studies. After several days without sleep, participants report perceptual distortions. Shadows move. Sounds feel amplified. Thoughts become disorganized. In rare cases, hallucinations appear. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurs. The brain begins intruding dreamlike activity into waking life because it cannot sustain alertness any longer. What makes this frightening is how quickly personality shifts. People become less empathetic, more self-focused. Morality itself becomes flexible. In experiments, sleep-deprived participants are more likely to cheat, lie, or take risks they would normally avoid. Not because their values changed, but because impulse control collapsed. The brain prioritizes short-term relief over long-term consequence. Neurologically, this happens because sleep clears metabolic waste from the brain. Without sleep, toxins accumulate, neural communication degrades, and emotional circuits dominate rational ones. Memory consolidation fails. Learning stalls. The brain is awake, but inefficient and unstable. There is a validating truth hidden here. If you have ever said things you regret when exhausted, if you have ever felt emotionally numb or irrational after no sleep, if you have ever felt like a worse version of yourself at 3 in the morning, that was not character failure. That was biology. What sleep deprivation experiments show is that self-control is not infinite. It is supported by rest. When rest is removed, behavior changes in predictable ways. Patience shortens. Perspective narrows. Everything feels more urgent and more personal than it really is. Perhaps the most unsettling insight is that chronic partial sleep deprivation can be worse than total deprivation. Losing 1 or 2 hours a night over weeks produces cognitive impairment similar to staying awake for a full day. But because it feels normal, people adapt to feeling impaired without realizing it. The brain recalibrates to exhaustion as baseline. This has implications far beyond the lab. Work cultures that glorify burnout, schedules that reward sleeplessness, environments where rest is treated as weakness. The experiments make one thing clear. A tired brain is not a strong brain. It is a compromised one. As this settles in, the unease comes from recognition. How many decisions are made while exhausted? How many conflicts escalate because sleep was missing? How many versions of ourselves exist only because the brain was not given time to repair? Sleep deprivation experiments do not just show what happens when we stay awake. They show who we become when the systems that keep us regulated quietly fail. And once you see how much of behavior depends on rest, it becomes harder to ignore the cost of pretending sleep is optional. The sensory deprivation tank studies, at first, there is relief. No noise, no light, no demands pulling at your attention. Your body floats effortlessly, held by warm salt water. For a few minutes, it feels like rest in its purest form. And then something unexpected happens. Your mind, deprived of the outside world, turns inward in ways most people are not prepared for. Sensory deprivation tank studies were designed to answer a simple question. What happens to the human mind when external stimulation is removed? The tanks block light, sound, and touch as much as possible. The water is kept at skin temperature, so the body fades from awareness. In theory, nothing is happening. In reality, a lot is happening. Early researchers believed sensory deprivation would be calming, and for short periods it can be. Stress hormones drop. Muscles relax. People report deep peace. But as time stretches on, the brain begins reacting in ways that are anything but calm. Humans are not built for nothingness. The brain is a prediction machine, and when it has no input, it starts generating its own. Within an hour or two, many participants report distortions. The sense of time slips. Minutes feel like hours or disappear entirely. Thoughts loop. Memories surface without warning. Some people feel their bodies growing larger or smaller. Others feel as if they are spinning or dissolving. These sensations are not imagined. They are the brain struggling to orient itself without feedback. This is where the shock sets in. In longer deprivation sessions, hallucinations become common. People see flashes of light, geometric patterns, faces, or entire scenes. Sounds emerge from nowhere. Voices, music, whispers. The brain begins filling the silence because silence, to the nervous system, feels like a problem to solve. Neurologically, this happens because sensory input normally anchors perception. When that input disappears, the brain increases internal noise. Activity in visual and auditory areas does not shut down. It amplifies. The mind turns memories, expectations, and random neural firing into experience. In other words, reality becomes internally generated. Some participants find this fascinating. Others find it terrifying. Anxiety spikes. Panic can emerge suddenly. Without external cues to ground themselves, people can lose the sense of where they end and the world begins. The ego loosens. For some, that feels spiritual. For others, it feels like losing control. What makes sensory deprivation studies unsettling is how quickly personality differences emerge. People who crave control often struggle more. People with unresolved trauma may encounter intrusive memories. The tank does not create these thoughts. It removes the distractions that normally keep them buried. In that sense, the tank becomes a mirror with nothing to look at but yourself. Researchers noticed another pattern. The longer the deprivation, the harder it became to think clearly afterward. Attention suffered. Problem-solving declined. Emotional sensitivity increased. The brain, starved of input, became less efficient at processing it once it returned. This revealed something important. Stimulation is not just noise. It is structure. There were also ethical concerns. In extreme sensory deprivation studies, participants experienced confusion, emotional instability, and lingering distress. Some reported changes in how they perceived reality even after leaving the tank. These effects raised questions about interrogation techniques and isolation practices, where sensory deprivation is used deliberately to break resistance. This connects to something deeply human. Isolation does not need physical pain to cause harm. Removing stimulation removes reference points. Without reference points, the mind becomes vulnerable. This is why solitary confinement is so damaging. The brain needs engagement to stay regulated. Without it, internal chaos takes over. There is a validating truth hidden here. If you have ever felt your thoughts spiral in silence, if stillness made you anxious instead of calm, If being alone with your mind felt overwhelming, that is not because you are broken. It is because the brain is designed to interact, not float in a vacuum. Modern life rarely gives us true sensory deprivation, but it gives us fragments of it. Long isolation, lack of touch, emotional numbness. The mind reacts the same way. It fills the gaps, often with anxiety or intrusive thoughts. The tank studies show that stimulation is not the enemy of peace. Balance is. Some people leave sensory deprivation tanks feeling refreshed and inspired. Others leave shaken. Both responses make sense. When the outside world disappears, the inside world becomes louder. And not everyone likes what they hear when there is nothing left to drown it out. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from realizing how thin the boundary is between calm and disintegration. How much of stability depends on feedback we barely notice. Light, sound, contact, orientation. Remove them, and the mind does not rest, it searches. The sensory deprivation tank studies do not prove that silence is dangerous. They prove that the human mind needs anchors. Without them, it creates its own reality. And once you understand that, it becomes harder to romanticize emptiness without respecting the psychological cost of staring into it for too long. The Stanford Marshmallow experiment and delayed gratification. It looks harmless, almost cute. A child sits at a small table. In front of them is a single marshmallow. Soft, sweet. Right there. The researcher explains the rules and leaves the room. The child can eat the marshmallow now or wait a little while and get to later. That is it. No pressure. No threat. Just time and temptation. And yet this simple moment became one of the most unsettling mirrors of human behavior ever studied. The Stanford Marshmallow experiment began in the late 1960s. Psychologist Walter Mischel wanted to understand self-control, more specifically, delayed gratification, the ability to resist an immediate reward for a larger one later. At the time, this trait was believed to be central to success, discipline, and emotional regulation. What no one expected was how much this experiment would reveal about stress, trust, and the environment shaping choice. As soon as the researcher left the room, the real experiment began. Some children stared at the marshmallow. Some covered their eyes. Some sang. Some fidgeted. A few grabbed the marshmallow and ate it within seconds. Others waited the full time, hands clenched, bodies tense, fighting themselves every moment. This was not about intelligence. These were preschoolers. It was about coping. Here is the shock. When researchers followed up years later, they found correlations that startled people. Children who waited longer tended to have better academic outcomes, better stress tolerance, and fewer behavioral issues later in life. The conclusion spread quickly. Delayed gratification equals success. Eat the marshmallow later, win at life. But that conclusion hid something important. As the research evolved, psychologists began looking deeper. Why did some children wait and others not? It was not willpower alone. Children who distracted themselves were more likely to succeed. Turning away, playing games in their head, singing. The brain does not suppress temptation well. It redirects attention better. That insight alone reshaped how self-control is understood. Then came the more uncomfortable finding. A child's environment mattered more than their character. In later versions of the experiment, researchers manipulated trust. Some children were promised rewards that never came before the marshmallow test. Others experienced adults keeping their word. The children who had learned adults were unreliable ate the marshmallow quickly. Not because they were impulsive, but because waiting felt risky. This is the part that changes how you see the experiment. Delayed gratification is not just about patience. It is about belief. Belief that waiting will be rewarded. If your past has taught you that promises break, eating now is rational. If scarcity is familiar, immediate reward feels safer than imagined future gain. Psychologically, this ties into stress and survival. In unpredictable environments, the brain prioritizes now. Long-term planning requires safety. The nervous system must believe the future exists and is stable. Without that belief, restraint feels foolish. The child who eats immediately is not failing. They are adapting. This reframes everything. Self-control is not a moral trait. It is a skill supported by context. Children raised in stable, predictable environments have the luxury of waiting. Children raised in chaos often do not. The marshmallow test did not measure virtue. It measured trust in the world. There is also the emotional layer. Waiting was uncomfortable. Children squirmed. Their bodies showed stress. Delayed gratification requires tolerating discomfort without escaping it. That tolerance is learned through repeated experiences of discomfort followed by reward. Without those experiences, the brain learns a different rule. Discomfort means danger. End it now. This matters because adults still live out this pattern. Overspending, procrastination, addiction, emotional outbursts. These are often framed as failures of discipline, but many are rooted in nervous systems that do not trust delayed payoff. If the brain expects disappointment, immediate relief becomes the goal. Later research showed that when children were taught strategies to cope with waiting, performance improved dramatically. Self-control was trainable, not fixed. This dismantled the idea that the marshmallow test predicted destiny. It predicted exposure. The validation here is quiet but powerful. If you struggle with delayed gratification, it does not mean you are broken or weak. It may mean your system learned that waiting was unsafe. That hope was unreliable. That now was all that could be trusted. What makes the marshmallow experiment unsettling is not the candy. It is what it reveals about inequality, stress, and judgment. Society often praises those who wait and blames those who do not, without asking what kind of world taught them their strategies. As this thought settles in, the experiment stops being about children and desserts. It becomes about how behavior makes sense once you understand the conditions that shaped it. Delayed gratification is not just about resisting temptation. It is about trusting time itself. And once you see that, the marshmallow on the table is no longer a test of character. It is a test of whether the world has ever kept its promises to you. The Rosenhan experiment, Sanity inside insane asylums, it began with a lie so small it barely felt like one. 8 ordinary people walked into psychiatric hospitals across the United States and said a single thing. They were hearing a voice. The word was empty, hollow. Thud. Nothing else was wrong. No delusions, no disorganized thinking. Just that one symptom. And with that, their normal lives ended instantly. Psychologist David Rosenhan wanted to answer a question that most people never think to ask. Can professionals reliably tell the difference between sanity and insanity? Or more unsettling, once someone is labeled mentally ill, can that label ever be removed? Every pseudopatient was admitted, every one. Diagnosed with serious psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia. The moment they entered the hospital, the experiment truly began. They stopped faking symptoms immediately. They behaved normally. They followed rules. They were polite, calm, cooperative. But the diagnosis never changed. This is where the shock sets in. Ordinary behavior was interpreted as pathological. Taking notes was called compulsive writing. Waiting near the cafeteria was labeled oral fixation. Friendly conversations were recorded as inappropriate social behavior. Nothing they did could be seen as normal because the label came first. Once inside, the average stay was weeks. Some stayed months. To get released, patients had to accept their diagnosis and agree they were mentally ill but improving. Sanity became something you could not demonstrate directly. You had to confess illness to prove recovery. The terrifying insight was this: context swallowed identity. Once inside the asylum, everything about a person was filtered through the assumption of illness. The diagnosis shaped reality, not the other way around. Even more disturbing was who noticed. Nurses and doctors rarely questioned the pseudo-patient's sanity, but real patients did. Many said things like, "You are not crazy. You are a journalist or a professor." The ones labeled insane were often the most accurate observers in the room. Rosenhan was not done. After publishing the initial results, a hospital challenged him. They claimed they could detect fake patients easily. Rosenhan agreed to send pseudo-patients over the next 3 months. None were sent, yet staff confidently identified dozens of people as imposters. They were wrong. Every single time. This exposed a second flaw. Not only could sanity be mistaken for illness, but belief in expertise could create false certainty. When professionals expected deception, they saw it everywhere. Psychologically, this experiment revealed the power of labeling. Labels do not just describe, they define. Once a label is applied, perception follows it automatically. Confirmation bias takes over. Evidence that fits the label is noticed. Evidence that contradicts it is ignored or reinterpreted. The validation here is deeply personal. If you have ever felt misunderstood by a system, if you were reduced to a diagnosis, a file, a reputation, if everything you did was judged through a single story about who you are, this experiment explains why it felt impossible to be seen clearly. Rosenhan also highlighted the dehumanization built into institutions. Patients were rarely addressed by name. Privacy was minimal. Conversations were interrupted. Decisions were made without explanation. The environment itself reinforced helplessness. When people are treated like diagnoses, they begin to feel like them. The experiment forced psychiatry to confront uncomfortable truths. Diagnostic categories were not as objective as believed. Context mattered. Observer expectation mattered. Power mattered. It did not mean mental illness was fake. It meant the system for identifying it was fragile. Critics argued the study was unfair, that hospitals were not designed to detect fakers. That deception invalidated the results. But that criticism missed the point. If a system cannot recognize normal behavior when it sees it, the consequences are real regardless of intent. The deeper fear Rosenhan uncovered was this: once a powerful institution defines you, escaping that definition is nearly impossible. Evidence does not free you. Compliance does. Agreement does. You must accept the story to leave the story. This experiment changed mental health practices. It pushed for better diagnostic standards, more humane treatment, and awareness of bias. But its emotional weight lingers far beyond psychiatry. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from imagining yourself in that position. Knowing you are sane, acting normally, and still being seen as broken because someone decided you were. The loss of agency. The quiet panic of not being believed. The Rosenhan experiment was not about tricking doctors. It was about exposing how easily authority replaces observation, how labels become cages, and how fragile the line between normal and abnormal really is. Once you understand that sanity can disappear the moment someone stops questioning their own assumptions. The experiment stops being a historical study and becomes a warning, not just about mental health systems, but about any place where labels are allowed to matter more than the human standing in front of them. The Bystander effect and the Kitty Genovese case. It happened in the middle of the night in a city full of people, lights, and windows. A woman was attacked outside her apartment building. She screamed, she fought, she cried for help, and afterward, the story that spread across the world was this: dozens of people heard her and did nothing. That idea lodged itself deep into the public imagination, and it became a symbol of something terrifying. Not violence, but silence. The case was Kitty Genovese, and it became the foundation for what psychologists later called the bystander effect. The basic question was unsettling. Why do people fail to help when others are present? Why does responsibility seem to dissolve in groups? In the years after the case, researchers John Darley and Bib Latanai decided to test this phenomenon in controlled experiments. They placed participants in situations where someone appeared to be in distress. Smoke filling a room, a person having a seizure over an intercom, a cry for help. The key variable was whether the participant believed they were alone or part of a group. The results were disturbing. When people thought they were the only one witnessing the emergency, they helped quickly. When they believed others were also present, response times slowed dramatically. Sometimes no one helped at all. The presence of others did not increase action, it reduced it. This is the shock. People were not ignoring suffering because they were cruel. They were frozen by a psychological process called diffusion of responsibility. When more people are present, each individual feels less personally responsible. The mind quietly assumes someone else will step in, and if no one does, inaction becomes normalized. There is also something called pluralistic ignorance. In uncertain situations, people look to others for cues on how to behave. If everyone else seems calm, the situation is interpreted as non-urgent. Silence becomes information. Everyone waits, and waiting itself becomes the signal that nothing is wrong. This explains something deeply unsettling. In emergencies, hesitation spreads faster than action. One person pausing can influence everyone else. The brain is wired to avoid standing out, especially when the situation is ambiguous. Acting alone carries social risk. What if you are wrong? What if you overreact? What if you embarrass yourself? Those questions compete with empathy in real time. The Kitty Genovese case intensified this fear because it was framed as moral failure. Headlines claimed dozens of witnesses watched and did nothing. Later investigations showed the story was exaggerated. Fewer people witnessed the attack. Many did not understand what was happening. Some did call the police. But the damage was already done. The narrative stuck because it felt true to something people feared about themselves. That fear is what the bystander effect exposes. Not that people are heartless, but that responsibility feels heavier when carried alone. Helping requires breaking the spell of the group, stepping forward when no one else has, becoming visible. Experiments also showed how fragile this paralysis is. When participants were directly addressed, when someone said you call for help or you go check, action increased sharply. Responsibility became specific. Once the mind knew this was mine to handle, behavior changed. This matters because emergencies rarely announce themselves clearly. Real life is ambiguous. Sounds are unclear. Situations are confusing, and the presence of others creates a false sense of safety. If it were serious, someone would be doing something. That assumption can be deadly. The validation here is uncomfortable but human. If you have ever hesitated in a moment when someone needed help, if you have ever looked around first instead of acting immediately, that does not make you immoral. It means your brain was negotiating risk, responsibility, and social consequence all at once. The danger is not that people do not care. It is that care alone does not guarantee action. Action requires ownership. It requires the decision to interrupt the group and accept responsibility without permission. The bystander effect shows up everywhere: online harassment, public emergencies, workplace misconduct. When many people see harm, fewer feel responsible to stop it. Silence multiplies because everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. What makes this haunting is how ordinary it is. No villains, no monsters, just people unsure of what to do, caught in a loop of hesitation. And once you understand that, the question shifts. It is no longer why did no one help? It becomes what would it take for one person to move? As this settles in, the discomfort comes from recognition, from knowing that the difference between help and silence can be as small as one person deciding this is mine to act on. The Kitty Genovese case did not just expose a psychological effect. It exposed how easily responsibility disappears when it is shared by everyone. And once you see how fragile action can be in a crowd, you start to wonder how many moments in life are waiting for a single person to step forward and break the silence before it becomes the story. The CIA's MK Ultra mind control experiments. It did not start with torture rooms or wild conspiracies. It started with fear. Quiet fear inside government offices during the Cold War. Fear that enemies had found a way to control minds. Fear that free will itself could be hijacked. And when fear takes the lead, ethics tend to follow slowly, if at all. In the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a series of secret programs under a name that sounded harmless: MK Ultra. The goal was simple in theory and terrifying in practice: find ways to manipulate human behavior, extract information, implant suggestions, break resistance. If mind control was possible, they wanted to own it first. The experiments were not confined to one lab or one method. They were scattered across universities, hospitals, prisons, and military facilities. Many subjects had no idea they were part of an experiment at all. Some were told they were receiving therapy. Others thought they were volunteering for routine research. Consent, as we understand it today, was often absent. One of the most infamous tools used was LSD. At the time, it was poorly understood and legally available. Researchers believed it might loosen the mind, make people suggestible, erase memories, or induce confessions. Subjects were dosed without warning. Some were given it repeatedly. Others were observed behind one-way mirrors while they experienced confusion, paranoia, or complete psychological breakdown. This is where the shock lands. People were not just tested, they were destabilized. Some experienced intense anxiety and dissociation. Some lost their sense of identity. One man, a scientist named Frank Olson, was dosed without his knowledge and later died after falling from a hotel window. Whether it was suicide or something else remains debated, but the damage was undeniable. MK Ultra did not stop at drugs. Researchers explored sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, hypnosis, electroshock, verbal abuse, and isolation. The idea was to strip a person down mentally and rebuild them into someone more compliant. Break the self, then see what could be inserted into the empty space. Psychologically, this relied on a dangerous assumption that the mind could be wiped clean like a chalkboard. But what actually happened was fragmentation. Trauma does not erase identity cleanly. It shatters it. Instead of control, the experiments often produced confusion, long-term mental illness, and emotional damage that never fully healed. What makes MK Ultra especially disturbing is how ordinary the machinery was. Doctors, professors, institutions people trusted. The harm was delivered through credentials and calm voices, not dark alleys. Authority gave the experiments legitimacy, and legitimacy silenced doubt. There is a mechanism here that matters. When people believe they are acting in the name of national security, moral boundaries shift. Harm becomes justified as necessary. This is called moral licensing. The belief that a higher goal excuses lower-level cruelty. Once that belief takes hold, almost anything can be rationalized. For years, MK Ultra remained hidden. Records were destroyed. Files disappeared. It was not until the 1970s that congressional investigations uncovered parts of the program. Even then, the full scope was never known. Many victims were never identified. Some were dismissed as unstable rather than acknowledged as harmed. The validation in this story is subtle but important. If reading this makes you feel uneasy, that reaction is grounded. This was not science gone wrong by accident. It was power experimenting on vulnerability. People were reduced to tools, their inner worlds treated as territory to conquer. MK Ultra also leaves behind a quieter question. If the mind can be influenced this deeply through fear, isolation, and authority, how much control do we really have in everyday life? Advertising, propaganda, social pressure, trauma. None of these need secret programs to shape behavior. They work because the brain is adaptable, not invincible. The experiments ultimately failed in their grand ambition. No reliable method of mind control was created. But that does not make the program meaningless. It proved something else, that the desire to control others can become more dangerous than the threat it claims to protect against. What lingers is not just anger at the CIA. It is discomfort with the human tendency to justify harm when it feels strategic, to sacrifice individuals for abstract goals, to believe that intelligence or authority makes someone immune to moral drift. As this settles in, the unease comes from recognizing how fragile autonomy really is, how much it depends on transparency, consent, and limits. MK Ultra did not show how to control the mind. It showed how easily trust can be weaponized. And once you understand that, the experiment stops being a historical scandal and becomes a warning. Not about mind control in the dramatic sense, but about what happens when fear convinces powerful people that other minds are objects instead of lives. The phantom pain experiments and the power of the mind. Pain can exist without a wound. That idea alone feels wrong to most people. We are taught that pain comes from damage, from something broken in the body. But phantom pain experiments revealed something far more unsettling. The body can hurt even when the body part is gone. And when that happens, the pain is not imagined. It is real, intense, and rooted in the mind. Phantom limb pain was first widely observed in amputees who reported vivid sensations in limbs that no longer existed. Fingers that burned, toes that cramped, arms that twisted into painful positions. These sensations were not vague. They were specific and persistent. At first, doctors assumed it was psychological distress or exaggeration, but the pain did not fade with reassurance. It demanded explanation. Researchers began studying what happens in the brain after amputation. They discovered that the brain does not update its body map easily. In the sensory cortex, each body part has a dedicated area. When a limb is removed, that area does not go quiet. It keeps firing. The brain still expects input, and when it does not get it, it fills the silence with sensation. This is where the shock deepens. Some experiments showed that touching other parts of the body could trigger pain in the missing limb. A stroke on the cheek might cause pain in a phantom hand. This happened because the brain had rewired itself. Neighboring regions in the sensory map took over unused territory, but the original interpretation remained. The brain misattributed sensation. The mind created pain where no body part existed. One of the most revealing tools used to study this was mirror therapy. A mirror was placed so that a patient saw the reflection of their intact limb where the missing one should be. When they moved the real limb, the brain perceived movement in the phantom limb. For some patients, the pain eased. For others, it disappeared entirely. The brain, given visual feedback, updated its belief. This is the unsettling insight. The pain was not fixed. It was maintained by expectation. When the brain believed the limb was still clenched or damaged, pain persisted. When that belief was interrupted, relief followed. The mind was not pretending. It was protecting itself based on outdated information. Phantom pain experiments forced neuroscience to confront a hard truth. Pain is not a direct signal from tissue. It is an interpretation. The brain evaluates context, memory, expectation, and threat, then decides whether pain is necessary. Sometimes it gets that decision wrong. This explains why phantom pain can feel worse under stress. Stress heightens threat detection. The brain becomes more vigilant. Old pain patterns reactivate. The nervous system assumes danger and responds accordingly. Pain becomes a warning without a clear target. The validation here matters. People experiencing phantom pain are often told it is all in their head. That phrase dismisses the reality of their suffering. But the truth is more complex. Pain is always processed in the head. That does not make it unreal. It makes it neurological. These experiments changed how chronic pain is understood. Back pain with no injury, migraines without clear cause, fibromyalgia. In many cases, the nervous system has learned pain. It has memorized it. The brain keeps sending danger signals even when tissue is healed. The body becomes trapped in an alarm loop. From a psychological perspective, this is learning and conditioning. The brain pairs certain movements or sensations with threat. Over time, the association strengthens. Pain appears before damage because the brain is trying to prevent harm before it happens. The intention is protective. The outcome is suffering. What makes phantom pain experiments so disturbing is what they suggest about reality. If pain can exist without a limb, how much of experience is constructed rather than detected? How many sensations are predictions rather than facts? The brain is not a camera. It is a storyteller. There is also hope hidden here. If pain is learned, it can be unlearned. Not instantly, not easily, but through retraining the brain. New feedback, new movement, new safety signals. That is why therapies focused on perception and nervous system regulation can help where medication alone fails. The deeper implication is this: the mind is not separate from the body. It is the body's interpreter. When interpretation goes wrong, suffering follows. But when interpretation changes, experience changes too. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from realizing how powerful belief really is. Not belief in the motivational sense, but belief encoded in neural circuits. The brain believes a limb is still there, believes it is in danger, and pain becomes the language of that belief. The phantom pain experiments do not tell us that pain is imaginary. They tell us something more unsettling, that the mind can create reality so convincingly that the body obeys. And once you understand that, you begin to see pain not just as a symptom, but as a message shaped by memory, fear, and expectation. That realization changes how you listen to pain, not as proof of damage, but as evidence of a mind trying, sometimes desperately, to keep you safe even when it no longer knows what safety looks like. The placebo effect experiments that fooled the brain. It starts with something small, a pill, a shot, a procedure. You are told it will help. Nothing dramatic happens at first. Then the pain eases, the nausea fades, the symptoms soften, and the unsettling question appears quietly in the background. What if nothing active was ever there? The placebo effect experiments exposed one of the most uncomfortable truths in psychology and medicine. The brain can trigger real physical change based on belief alone. Not imagination, not pretending. Actual measurable changes in the body. Hormones shift, neurotransmitters release, pain pathways quiet down, healing responses activate. All because the mind expects relief. Early placebo studies were meant to control for bias in drug trials. Researchers gave some participants real medication and others inactive substances. Sugar pills, saline injections, fake procedures. What shocked them was how often the placebo group improved, sometimes dramatically. In some cases, almost as much as the treatment group. This forced scientists to confront a disturbing reality. The brain is not a passive observer of the body. It is an active participant. When you believe something will help, your nervous system prepares for improvement. Endorphins release. Dopamine increases. Stress hormones drop. The body enters a state that makes relief more likely. Pain studies revealed this most clearly. In experiments, participants given placebo painkillers showed reduced activity in pain-processing regions of the brain. The relief was not imagined. Brain scans confirmed it. When belief was removed, the pain returned. When belief was reinforced, relief strengthened. Here is where the shock deepens. Placebos do not just affect pain. They influence immune response, motor function, mood, and even Parkinson's symptoms. In some Parkinson's studies, placebo treatments triggered dopamine release similar to real medication. The brain responded as if help had arrived. This does not mean diseases are fake. It means perception and expectation shape how the body responds to illness. The brain constantly predicts what will happen next. When it predicts healing, it adjusts physiology accordingly. When it predicts danger, it does the opposite. There is also the darker twin of the placebo effect, called the nocebo effect. When people expect harm, they experience harm. In experiments, participants warned about side effects often develop them even when given inert substances. Headaches, nausea, fatigue. The brain prepares for pain and delivers it. This reveals something deeply unsettling. Belief is not just comforting. It is biological. Expectation becomes chemistry. Words from authority figures can change outcomes. The way a treatment is framed matters as much as the treatment itself. Doctors noticed that placebos worked better when they looked more convincing. Larger pills, injections instead of tablets, branded packaging, confident delivery, even open-label placebos, where patients were told the pill was inactive, still produced benefits, if the explanation made sense. The brain responded to ritual and meaning. This leads to an uncomfortable validation. If you have ever felt better after reassurance, if symptoms eased once you believed help was coming, that does not mean you were weak or gullible. It means your brain did exactly what it evolved to do: anticipate outcomes and adjust the body to match. Evolutionarily, this makes sense. If the brain expects recovery, conserving energy and reducing stress improves survival. Belief becomes a signal that danger is passing. The body follows that signal. The danger lies in misunderstanding this power. The placebo effect does not mean you can think your way out of serious illness. It means mindset influences response, not that it replaces treatment. The brain can assist healing. It cannot substitute for reality. What makes placebo experiments eerie is how they blur the line between mind and body. Where does treatment end and belief begin? If a fake pill reduces pain, was the pain ever just physical? If expectation can trigger neurotransmitters, how much of experience is prediction rather than detection? There is also an ethical tension. Should doctors use placebo responses deliberately? Is it manipulation or care? Modern medicine struggles with this question. Deception can erode trust, but ignoring the placebo effect wastes a powerful ally. The deeper lesson is not about pills. It is about meaning. Humans respond to symbols, rituals, and stories. The brain interprets context and decides what state the body should be in. Healing environments matter. Trust matters. Explanation matters. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from realizing how easily belief shapes reality, how authority and expectation can alter experience without touching the underlying cause. The brain is not just reacting to the world. It is constantly guessing what comes next. The placebo effect experiments do not prove the mind is magical. They prove it is influential. Belief does not cure everything, but it changes more than we like to admit. And once you see how deeply expectation reaches into the body, it becomes harder to dismiss the quiet power of the mind shaping what feels real. The Stanford Learned Aggression Studies. It begins with a room that feels almost playful. Toys scattered across the floor. A large inflatable doll standing upright, smiling in that empty way only toys can. A child is led inside, curious, relaxed, unaware that anything meaningful is about to happen. Nothing about the setup feels dangerous. That is what makes what comes next so disturbing. At Stanford University in the early 1960s, psychologist Albert Bandura wanted to understand where aggression comes from. At the time, many believed aggression was instinctual, something buried deep inside and triggered by frustration. Bandura questioned that idea. He suspected something far more unsettling, that aggression could be learned simply by watching. In what became known as the Bobo doll experiments, children were first placed in a room where they observed an adult interacting with the toy. Some adults behaved calmly. Others acted aggressively. They hit the doll, yelled at it, knocked it down, and kept going. The children did not participate. They only watched. Then the children were taken into a different room with the same toys. No instructions, no encouragement, just freedom to play. This is where the shock hits. Children who had observed aggressive adults began imitating the behavior almost immediately. They struck the doll, used the same phrases, recreated the violence with eerie accuracy. Children who had watched calm adults showed little to no aggression. Nothing inside the child had been activated by frustration. Something had been copied. Bandura showed that aggression did not need to be released. It needed to be modeled. The most disturbing detail came later. When children saw the aggressive adult rewarded or praised, their aggressive behavior increased even more. When the adult was punished, aggression decreased. This revealed a critical mechanism. The brain does not just learn behavior. It learns which behaviors are acceptable by watching consequences. Psychologically, this is observational learning. Humans are wired to learn by imitation, especially in childhood. The brain treats observed behavior as information about how the world works. When a behavior appears effective or rewarded, the brain tags it as useful. No personal experience is required. This challenges a comforting belief that children know right from wrong instinctively, that they will reject harmful behavior naturally. The experiments showed the opposite. Children absorb behavior without moral filtering. Morality is not innate. It is taught through example. The validation here is uncomfortable but necessary. If you grew up around anger, yelling, or violence, it shaped you whether anyone intended it or not. Behavior modeled consistently becomes normalized. The nervous system learns patterns before language can intervene. Bandura also found that children were more likely to imitate models they perceived as powerful or authoritative. Adults, confident figures, people who seemed in control. This matters because it explains why aggression spreads downward through hierarchies, from parents to children, from leaders to followers, from media to viewers. Later versions of the experiment replaced live adults with filmed behavior. The results barely changed. Children learned aggression from screens just as easily. This shattered the idea that indirect exposure was harmless. The brain does not fully distinguish between real and observed experience when learning behavior. This is where the implications widen. Violence in media, hostility in households, public figures modeling cruelty. These are not neutral, they are instructions. Even when framed as entertainment or justified anger, the behavior still teaches. What makes the Stanford learned aggression studies so unsettling is how simple the mechanism is. No trauma required. No abuse, just observation. The child does not need to be hurt to learn how to hurt. There is also a quieter layer. Aggression learned this way often feels justified to the person expressing it, because it was learned as normal, as effective, as acceptable. People rarely trace their reactions back to models they absorbed years earlier. The behavior feels like choice, not inheritance. Bandura did not argue that humans are doomed to aggression. He showed the opposite. Prosocial behavior is learned the same way. Kindness, patience, cooperation. Children imitate those behaviors when they see them modeled and rewarded. The mechanism is neutral. The input determines the output. This reframes responsibility, not just for parents but for cultures, for leaders, for anyone being watched. Behavior does not exist in isolation. It teaches even when you are not trying to teach. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from realizing how little aggression needs to take root, how easily it spreads through example, and how often people blame nature for what was learned quietly over time. The Stanford learned aggression studies do not say humans are violent by default. They say humans are mirrors. And once you understand that, the question stops being why are people so aggressive and becomes what are they being shown again and again until it feels normal. The facial feedback hypothesis experiments. Before you feel happy, your face might already know. That sounds backward, but the facial feedback hypothesis experiments were built around this unsettling idea that emotion does not always start inside and move outward. Sometimes it begins with muscles you barely notice moving, and only afterward does the feeling arrive. The idea itself feels almost offensive to how people understand emotions. We like to believe feelings come first. That we smile because we are happy, frown because we are sad, scowl because we are angry. The experiment suggested something far stranger. That the act of smiling can make you feel happy. That the body can quietly lead the mind. In the 1970s, psychologists began testing this by manipulating facial expressions without telling participants what was really being studied. In one famous experiment, People were asked to hold a pen in their mouth in different ways. One position forced the muscles used in smiling. Another blocked them. Participants were then shown cartoons and asked to rate how funny they were. Here is the shock. The people whose facial muscles were arranged into a smile rated the cartoons as significantly funnier. They did not know they were smiling. They did not know emotion was the subject. Their faces moved first. Their feelings followed. This was not about pretending. No one was told to act happy. The nervous system simply received feedback from facial muscles and interpreted it as emotional information. The brain asked itself a quiet question. Why are these muscles activated? And it answered with a feeling. Neurologically, this makes sense. The face is packed with sensory nerves that send constant feedback to the brain. When certain muscles contract, they activate patterns associated with emotion. The brain does not always check why those muscles moved. It just updates the emotional state accordingly. This flips the traditional model of emotion on its head. Instead of stimulus, emotion, expression, the order can be stimulus, expression, emotion. Sometimes there is no stimulus at all. Just posture, just muscle movement, just feedback. The discomfort deepens when you realize how often this happens without awareness. People who habitually frown may feel more irritable. People who sit slouched may feel more defeated. The body quietly influences mood all day long, even when the mind believes it is in charge. The validation here is subtle but powerful. If you have ever noticed your mood improve after smiling at someone, if standing taller made you feel more confident, if forcing yourself to relax your jaw reduced tension, that was not placebo, that was feedback. The body signaling safety or threat to the brain. Facial feedback experiments also explored negative emotion. When participants were asked to form expressions associated with anger or sadness, their reported mood shifted in that direction. Heart rate changed. Stress markers rose. The face was not just reflecting emotion, it was helping create it. This matters because it challenges the idea that emotions are fixed reactions. They are processes, loops, the brain and body constantly influencing each other. Break the loop at the body level, and the emotional experience can shift. Critics later argued about replication. Some studies showed weaker effects, others showed strong ones. But even when the effect size varied, the core insight remained intact. The body contributes to emotion. It is not just along for the ride. What makes these experiments eerie is how small the inputs are. A few facial muscles, a slight change in posture, a subtle shift in expression. These are not dramatic actions. They are everyday movements most people never question. Yet they can tilt emotional experience without permission. This also explains why emotions can feel sticky. If your face, posture, and breathing stay locked in one pattern, the brain keeps receiving the same message. The feeling sustains itself. Changing thoughts alone may not be enough. The body needs to change too. There is an uncomfortable implication here. Emotional authenticity becomes blurry. If smiling makes you feel happier, is that fake or functional? If changing your posture shifts confidence, is that manipulation or regulation? The experiments suggest the distinction matters less than we think. Humans evolved to read bodies, including their own. The brain treats physical signals as data. When the data changes, interpretation changes. Emotion updates. As this settles in, the unsettling thought is not that emotions are controllable like switches. They are not. It is that they are more flexible than we assume. Influenced by habits, expressions, and physical patterns learned over time. The facial feedback hypothesis experiments do not say you should force happiness. They say the boundary between body and feeling is thin. That emotion is not just something that happens to you. It is something your entire system participates in creating. And once you understand that your face is not just showing the world how you feel, but quietly telling your brain what to feel, it becomes harder to ignore how much power lies in the smallest movements you make without thinking. The False Memory Experiments by Elizabeth Loftus. At some point, everyone has a memory they would swear is real. You can picture it clearly. Where you were, what was said, how it felt, and the unsettling truth is this: that memory might never have happened at all. Elizabeth Loftus built her career around proving something deeply uncomfortable. Human memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you are rebuilding it, not replaying it. And that rebuilding process is vulnerable to suggestion in ways most people never expect. In the 1970s, Loftus began running experiments that gently, almost innocently, altered people's memories. Participants were shown videos of car accidents. Later, they were asked questions about what they saw. But the questions were subtly different. How fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Or how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? That single word change mattered. People who heard smashed reported higher speeds, more damage. Some even remembered broken glass that was never there. The event had not changed. Only the wording did. And yet the memory itself shifted. This was the first shock. Memory does not just store facts. It absorbs interpretation. Language reshapes recollection without permission. Then Loftus went further. In one of her most disturbing experiments, participants were told several stories from their childhood, supposedly provided by family members. Most were true. One was completely false, being lost in a shopping mall as a child. The event never happened. After repeated interviews, many participants began to remember it, not just vaguely, in detail: the fear, the surroundings, the relief when they were found. Some added sensory details, smells, sounds, emotions. The memory felt real because to the brain it was real. This is where the discomfort deepens. The brain does not label memories as true or false. It labels them as familiar. If a story is repeated, imagined, and emotionally processed, it can be stored the same way as lived experience. Neurologically, this happens because memory relies on the hippocampus and related networks that reconstruct events using fragments. Facts, emotions, context, expectation. When suggestion fills in gaps, the brain accepts it as part of the story. There is no internal alarm that says this was planted. What makes false memory experiments so unsettling is how easily confidence follows error. Participants did not say, "I think this happened." They said, "I remember this happening." Confidence increased as the false memory strengthened. The more vivid it became, the more certain they felt. This has devastating implications. Eyewitness testimony was once considered one of the strongest forms of evidence. Loftus showed that it is fragile. Police questioning, leading questions, media coverage, even casual conversation can reshape a witness's memory. By the time someone testifies, they may be reporting a memory that has been edited many times without their awareness. The validation here is crucial. If you have ever argued with someone about a shared past and felt confused by how different your memories were, this explains why. It is not that one person is lying. It is that two brains rebuilt the same event differently. False memory does not require malice. It requires suggestion plus imagination. That combination is enough. Loftus's work became controversial because it challenged deeply held beliefs, especially around recovered memories of trauma. She showed that while trauma is real and devastating, memory recovery techniques can unintentionally create memories that feel real but are not. This does not mean people are faking. It means the mind is vulnerable when searching for answers. This is where the emotional logic cuts deepest. The brain wants coherence. It wants stories that explain pain. When given a narrative, even a false one, it can adopt it if it makes sense of suffering. Memory becomes meaning-driven, not fact-driven. What makes this terrifying is how often memory defines identity. Who hurt us? What shaped us? What we believe about ourselves. If memory can be altered, then identity can shift too. There is also a quieter implication. Every time you recall a memory, you slightly change it. The act of remembering is also an act of rewriting. Details fade. New emotions attach. Current beliefs color past events. Over time, the memory drifts from the original experience. The false memory experiments do not say memory is useless. They say it is human, flexible, adaptive, but unreliable. As this settles in, the unease comes from realizing how much certainty we place in recollection. How often we say, "I remember, therefore it is true." Loftus showed that feeling certain is not proof of accuracy. It is proof of repetition. Once you understand that memory is not a vault, but a story you keep retelling, the past becomes less solid, and that realization lingers quietly, making you wonder how many moments you carry with absolute confidence were shaped not by what happened, but by how often and how convincingly they were suggested. The Stanford Sleep and Dream Manipulation Studies. Sleep feels like surrender. You lie down, close your eyes, and trust that your mind will take care of itself while you are gone. But the Stanford Sleep and Dream Manipulation Studies uncovered something quietly unsettling. When you fall asleep, your brain does not turn off. It opens up. And in that open state, it becomes far more influenceable than most people ever realize. At Stanford University, researchers studying sleep noticed early on that dreams were not random. They followed emotional themes. They reacted to recent experiences. They responded to the environment. That observation led to a question that felt harmless at first. If dreams respond to input, what happens when that input is controlled? In the sleep lab, participants were wired to machines that tracked brain waves, eye movement, and muscle tone. Researchers could tell precisely when someone entered rapid eye movement sleep, the stage where vivid dreaming happens. Instead of waking them, they introduced subtle stimuli, soft sounds, gentle words, faint smells. The sleeper never consciously noticed anything, but the dreams did. A dripping sound became rain inside a dream. A low hum turned into a distant engine. A whispered word shaped the emotional tone of the entire dream. Fearful cues led to anxious dream narratives. Calm cues softened them. The dreaming brain absorbed these signals and built stories around them without resistance. This is where the shock lands. The sleeping mind is not isolated. It is listening. Stanford researchers also explored dream incubation. Participants were asked to think about a topic before sleep, a problem, a memory, a fear. During REM sleep, related cues were quietly introduced. Dreams frequently incorporated those elements, often more vividly than expected. The brain took the suggestion and ran with it. Neurologically, this vulnerability makes sense. During REM sleep, the prefrontal cortex is less active. This is the part of the brain responsible for logic, skepticism, and self-monitoring. Emotional and sensory regions dominate instead. The brain becomes highly associative but poorly critical. It connects ideas freely without questioning their source. That combination makes dreams creative. It also makes them easy to steer. What disturbed researchers most was what happened after waking. Even when participants could not remember their dreams, their mood shifted. Anxiety lingered. Calmness carried over. Emotional reactions during the day reflected what had happened at night. The brain had learned something emotionally, even if the conscious mind had no record of it. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Influence does not require awareness. It only requires experience. And dreams feel real to the emotional brain. The validation here is subtle but powerful. If you have ever woken up feeling unsettled for no clear reason, if a dream mood followed you all day even after you forgot the details, that was not random. Your emotional brain was still processing something it experienced as real. Stanford studies also examined what happens when dreaming is disrupted. When REM sleep was repeatedly interrupted, participants became more irritable, anxious, and emotionally unstable. Concentration suffered. Stress tolerance dropped. Dreams were not meaningless noise. They were doing emotional regulation work. Without them, the mind began to fray. This led to a deeper realization. Sleep is not just rest, it is maintenance. Dreams help integrate memory, process fear, and regulate emotion. Interfere with that process, and psychological balance shifts. Some experiments explored learning during sleep. Complex information did not stick well, but emotional conditioning did. Pairing sounds with emotional tones during sleep altered how participants reacted to those sounds when awake. The brain formed associations without consent or awareness. This is where ethical alarm bells started ringing. If emotional responses can be shaped during sleep, where is the boundary? Advertising, conditioning, interrogation, manipulation. The same openness that allows healing could allow harm. What makes this especially eerie is how defenseless the sleeping mind is. Awake, you can question, you can doubt, you can reject ideas. Asleep, the gatekeeper is offline. The brain assumes safety and accepts input without checking its source. The studies did not prove full mind control. They proved something subtler and more disturbing. Influence works best when you do not know it is happening. There is also something deeply human here. Dreams are where fears surface safely, where trauma is processed, where creativity forms. That space exists because the brain trusts it. Manipulating it too aggressively risks breaking something essential. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from realizing how much trust is involved in sleep. You trust your environment. You trust the people around you. You trust that nothing is shaping you while you are gone. The Stanford sleep and dream manipulation studies do not tell us to fear sleep. They tell us to respect it. Sleep is not unconsciousness. It is a different mode of consciousness. One that is open, emotional, and highly impressionable. And once you understand that your sleeping mind is still listening, still learning, still responding, falling asleep feels less like shutting down and more like stepping into a place where the boundaries blur, and the mind, unguarded and creative, can be shaped without ever realizing it happened. The compliance experiments on forced confessions. It starts with exhaustion, not guilt. Hours pass. The room feels smaller. Questions repeat. You know you are innocent, but the certainty begins to blur. Not because you suddenly believe you did something wrong, but because your brain is desperate for the pressure to stop. This is where forced confession experiments begin, and why they are so disturbing. Psychologists studying compliance wanted to understand how innocent people could admit to crimes they never committed. The assumption used to be simple. Only the guilty confess. The experiments shattered that belief. One of the most influential researchers in this area was Saul Kassin. In controlled lab studies, participants were accused of causing harm they did not cause, like crashing a computer by pressing a forbidden key. Some participants were told there was evidence against them. Others were pressured repeatedly. Some were offered relief if they just admitted fault. The shock was immediate. Many innocent participants confessed, not because they were stupid, not because they were weak, but because the situation overwhelmed their ability to resist. Stress rose, confidence fell. The desire to escape the interrogation became stronger than the desire to be accurate. Psychologically, this works through compliance and internalization. Compliance happens when someone confesses to stop the pressure, even knowing they are innocent. Internalization is more unsettling. That is when people begin to doubt their own memory and actually believe they might be guilty. In some experiments, participants who falsely confessed later reconstructed memories of the event. They imagined details. They filled in gaps. Their brains tried to resolve the conflict between I confessed and I am innocent by altering belief, instead of resisting authority. This happens because memory is not stable under stress. High pressure impairs recall and increases suggestibility. When authority figures insist you did something, the brain starts questioning itself, especially if you are tired, isolated, or told evidence exists. False evidence was a powerful trigger in these studies. When participants were told there was video proof or witness confirmation, confession rates skyrocketed. The brain interprets evidence as reality even when it cannot access it directly. Trust in authority overrides trust in self. This is where the fear deepens. Interrogation techniques do not need physical harm to break someone. Psychological pressure is enough. Long questioning, isolation, repetition, certainty expressed by interrogators. These techniques wear down resistance quietly. The validation here is important. If you think you would never falsely confess, these experiments suggest otherwise. Under the right conditions, most people will comply. This is not a flaw in character. It is a feature of human psychology. The brain prioritizes immediate relief over long-term consequences when overwhelmed. Researchers also found that innocent people are actually more vulnerable. Guilty individuals know what they did and can anchor their story. Innocent people search their memory for answers and come up empty. That uncertainty makes them easier to sway. When someone insists you did something, and you cannot explain why they think that, doubt creeps in. Sleep deprivation made everything worse. Fatigue reduces critical thinking and increases compliance. Many real-world interrogations occur late at night or after long detentions. The experiments showed that exhaustion alone could push people toward confession. Another disturbing finding was how confessions changed outcomes. Even when later evidence proved innocence, confession biased judges, jurors, and investigators. People assume no one would admit guilt unless it were true. The confession becomes more powerful than facts. This explains why false confessions have led to real convictions. Innocent people imprisoned, lives destroyed, not because the system was evil, but because it misunderstood human psychology. The compliance experiments reveal something deeply unsettling. Truth is fragile under pressure. The brain is not built to withstand relentless authority in isolation. It is built to survive the moment. What makes this harder to accept is how ordinary the mechanisms are. No brainwashing, no torture, just stress, authority, and time. The same forces present in many everyday power dynamics. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from imagining yourself there. knowing you are innocent, feeling your confidence drain anyway, watching your own certainty erode as the need for relief grows stronger than the need to be right. The forced confession experiments do not tell us that people lie easily. They tell us that under pressure, the mind will sacrifice truth to escape suffering. And once you understand that, the idea of confession as ultimate proof collapses. What remains is a warning about power, about fatigue, about how easily certainty can be manufactured when the human brain is pushed past its limits. The Good Samaritan experiment on moral choice. It begins with a simple walk, a narrow path between buildings, a clipboard in hand, a task to complete. Nothing about the moment feels moral yet, and that is exactly why the Good Samaritan experiment is so unsettling. It shows how morality often fails not because people do not care, but because they are busy. In the early 1970s at Princeton Theological Seminary, psychologists John Darley and Daniel Batson wanted to understand why people help or do not help. The participants were seminarians, people studying to become religious leaders, individuals you would expect to act compassionately. They were told they needed to walk to another building to give a short talk. Here is the twist. Some were told they were early. Some were told they were right on time. Others were told they were already late and needed to hurry. Along the path, each participant encountered a man slumped in a doorway. He was coughing, groaning, clearly in distress. This was the experiment. Would they stop to help? The results were shocking. Whether the participant had just prepared a talk about the Good Samaritan parable made almost no difference. Whether they personally believed helping was important barely mattered. The strongest predictor of whether someone stopped was how rushed they felt. People who believed they were late almost always stepped over the suffering man. Some literally stepped around him, eyes forward, apologizing as they passed. People who were not rushed were far more likely to stop and help. This is where the discomfort sets in. Moral values did not disappear. They were overridden. Psychologically, this happens because urgency narrows attention. When the brain perceives time pressure, it enters goal completion mode. Everything not directly related to the task fades into the background. The suffering person becomes an obstacle, not a call to action. The brain is not asking what is right. It is asking what must be done now. This does not mean the participants were heartless. Many later reported feeling conflicted, guilty, disturbed by their own behavior. But in the moment, the situation framed helping as a threat to their primary goal. Being late felt more dangerous than ignoring suffering. The experiment revealed a painful truth. Moral action is highly situational. We like to believe we carry our ethics everywhere, ready to deploy. In reality, they are fragile, easily crowded out by stress, obligation, and perceived urgency. There is another layer that makes this even more unsettling. The participants were future clergy, people trained to notice suffering, people actively thinking about morality. If even they failed under time pressure, what does that say about everyone else? The validation here is uncomfortable but human. If you have ever walked past someone who needed help because you were late, if you told yourself someone else would handle it, if you felt a pang of guilt and kept moving anyway, this experiment explains why. Your values did not vanish. Your attention did. The Good Samaritan experiment also highlights something called situational attribution. We judge others based on character, lazy, cold, selfish, but we judge ourselves based on circumstance. I was busy, I was late, I had no choice. The experiment shows that circumstance often matters more than character. Another disturbing insight was how little awareness participants had of their own decision-making. Most did not say, "I chose not to help." They said, "I did not notice," or "I did not realize how serious it was." The brain protects self-image by editing perception. Helping requires more than good intentions. It requires mental space. It requires the ability to pause, to reframe the situation as urgent in a different way. When time pressure collapses that space, morality struggles to breathe. This has real-world implications. Modern life is built on urgency. Deadlines, notifications, schedules. The faster life moves, the easier it becomes to miss suffering right in front of us. Not because we are worse people, but because our attention is constantly hijacked. The experiment does not say people are hypocrites. It says morality competes with practicality, and practicality often wins. There is something quietly terrifying about that, because it means ethical behavior is not just about belief. It is about environment, about pace, about whether we allow ourselves to slow down enough to see. The Good Samaritan experiment forces an uncomfortable question. If being rushed makes us less humane, what kind of society are we building when everyone is always in a hurry? As this settles in, the unease comes from recognition, from realizing how often moral failure looks like efficiency, how easily compassion gets postponed until later, when later never comes. The experiment does not condemn us, it exposes us. It shows that goodness is not only about who we are, but about the conditions we move through every day. And once you understand that the difference between helping and walking past can be as small as a clock ticking too loudly in your head, you start to see moral choice not as a test of virtue, but as a fragile moment that depends on whether attention ever gets the chance to stop and look down. The Stanford prison experiment revisited. What changed? It starts the same way it always did. Volunteers are recruited. A basement is converted into a mock prison. Some are assigned the role of guard, others prisoner. The setup seems innocent, almost academic, but almost immediately, the air changes. That's what made the original Stanford prison experiment so infamous. Ordinary people transformed into oppressors and victims faster than anyone anticipated. But revisiting it today, we ask a different question. What changed since then? What did we learn that might prevent history from repeating itself? The original experiment in 1970, one was supposed to last 2 weeks. It ended after only 6 days. Guards became cruel. Prisoners became submissive, depressed, even traumatized. Zimbardo, the lead researcher, observed how social roles, anonymity, and authority could warp behavior. It became a textbook example of how situational forces often outweigh personal morality. Ordinary people, under the right pressures, could do horrifying things. Today, psychologists revisit the experiment with skepticism, ethical scrutiny, and more sophisticated methods. First, the environment has changed. Modern studies cannot replicate the extreme conditions because ethical standards forbid inducing real psychological harm. Researchers now use simulations with strict oversight, debriefing, and safety measures. The goal is observation without trauma. What changed in understanding is subtle but profound. Originally, the conclusion was almost deterministic. Situations overpower character. Guards were evil because the situation allowed it. Prisoners suffered because the system demanded submission. Today, psychologists add nuance. Personality still matters. Empathy, moral reasoning, and resilience influence how a person reacts to power dynamics. Situations amplify tendencies, but they do not erase identity entirely. The interaction is dynamic, not predetermined. Another major change is the recognition of demand characteristics. Later analyses suggest participants may have been acting in ways they thought were expected. Being a guard came with cultural scripts. People had seen prison in media. They may have exaggerated roles subconsciously. This does not negate the original findings, but adds complexity. Behavior was both situationally induced and socially performed. Ethical lessons have been seismic. Institutional review boards now enforce strict boundaries. Researchers cannot leave participants psychologically vulnerable without immediate exit options. Trauma prevention and informed consent are paramount. If the original experiment were attempted today, it would be shut down before it began. That alone shows how much has changed. Awareness of human vulnerability now guides research design. The revisited perspective also emphasizes long-term reflection. Many modern discussions focus on how participants interpreted their experience afterward. Guards who were cruel reported guilt. Prisoners remembered the intensity, but often credited the study with teaching them about social power. Awareness, reflection, and debriefing mitigate harm and allow ethical learning. Culturally, the experiment's reinterpretation challenges myths. It is no longer just a story of human darkness. It is a story of insight. Situations matter, but individuals still have agency. Awareness and safeguards can change outcomes. It teaches us about responsibility, not inevitability. Power is dangerous, but understanding power allows us to regulate it. Perhaps the most unsettling change is recognizing how little has changed outside the lab. Real prisons, workplaces, and hierarchical systems still replicate dynamics of authority and submission. Lessons from Stanford are widely cited, yet abusive systems persist. Revisiting the experiment reminds us that awareness alone does not prevent misuse of power. Structural safeguards and accountability are required. The Stanford prison experiment revisited is both caution and reflection. It shows that extreme behavior is not only possible but predictable under certain conditions. It shows how science and ethics evolve together, ensuring participants are protected today. It also reminds us that understanding human behavior is not enough. Application of that knowledge is crucial to prevent history from repeating itself. Ultimately, the revisited lens emphasizes responsibility. Situations influence behavior, yes, but knowledge, ethics, and self-awareness are tools that can counteract the darkest impulses. The experiment may never be replicated in its original form, but its lessons remain alive. Once you understand what changed, the haunting truth lingers: human behavior is malleable, and power corrupts not inevitably, but easily enough that vigilance is always necessary. The White Room torture and isolation studies. It starts with nothing, no sound, no color, no texture, just an endless, featureless white space. Time stretches. Minutes bleed into hours. The mind begins to fill the void with whatever it can conjure. This is the premise behind White Room isolation studies, and it is quietly horrifying. Humans are not designed to exist without stimuli. When stripped of it, the mind starts to rebel in ways that are both fascinating and terrifying. In the mid-20th century, psychologists and military researchers became interested in the effects of extreme sensory deprivation. Volunteers were placed in windowless rooms, painted white, often with padded floors and no clocks or external cues. Their only connection to reality was themselves. No sound, no light changes, no objects, sometimes not even their own reflection. Researchers wanted to observe what would happen when the brain had nothing external to process. The results were shocking. Within hours, participants reported heightened anxiety, restlessness, and disorientation. Thoughts that seemed trivial or under control in normal life became obsessive. Time perception collapsed. Some people felt like minutes were hours, others that hours were minutes. The brain, starved for input, created its own stimuli. Hallucinations appeared surprisingly fast. Some participants saw shapes, colors, or even people. Others heard voices. Simple tasks like keeping track of imaginary objects consumed enormous mental energy. Sleep became fragmented. Reality itself felt fluid. Volunteers described fear, panic, and the creeping sense that their mind was betraying them. Prolonged isolation intensified these effects. After days, cognitive function declined. Memory faltered. Concentration became nearly impossible. Some participants experienced paranoia, believing there were intruders or threats in the room. Emotional stability eroded. The longer the deprivation lasted, the more fragile the mind became. Psychologically, this happens because the brain is an active processor. Humans evolved in complex environments filled with sensory input. Sight, sound, touch, and temporal cues constantly calibrate perception and cognition. When those inputs disappear, the nervous system overcompensates. Neural circuits fire randomly, producing hallucinations and anxiety. The mind interprets emptiness as danger. What makes these studies particularly disturbing is how ordinary the environment seems. There is nothing overtly harmful in a white room. No physical threat, no pain. Yet the psychological toll is immense. It is a reminder that the mind requires interaction to remain anchored. Isolation alone becomes a form of torture. Ethically, the studies are controversial. Volunteers often consented, but many underestimated the intensity of the experience. Some left early, reporting lingering psychological effects. Others experienced disorientation and anxiety for days afterward. Modern ethics would prevent such extreme deprivation from being imposed without extensive safeguards. There is a quieter validation here. If you have ever felt anxious in silence or overwhelmed by isolation, the brain is signaling its need for input. Human minds are designed to connect, to objects, to environments, to other people. Remove that connection, and survival mechanisms activate. Fear, hallucination, and disorientation are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a system designed to process a world that is no longer there. The studies also revealed a subtle paradox. Some participants reported intense introspection, creative thoughts, and new perspectives. The mind, when forced inward, invents its own reality. But that creativity comes at a cost. The longer the isolation, the more unstable and fragmented those experiences become. White room isolation studies have real-world implications. Prison interrogation techniques, solitary confinement in jails, and extreme sensory deprivation in military or experimental contexts exploit exactly these vulnerabilities. The research demonstrates that even non-violent methods can produce profound psychological harm. As this settles in, the unease comes from recognizing how fragile the mind is when it lacks anchors, how quickly it will generate its own threats, distort reality, and panic. Isolation is not a neutral state. It is an active stressor. The White Room experiments do not exist to terrify for entertainment. They exist to warn. They reveal that the human brain is a creature of context. Remove context, and perception itself becomes a prison. And once you understand that, you start to see that true vulnerability is not physical. It is sensory, emotional, and profoundly psychological. The Hawthorne effect and being watched. It begins with a light bulb, literally. Researchers at the Hawthorne Works factory in the 1920s wanted to see if changing the lighting would affect worker productivity. They expected simple mechanical results: brighter light, more work; dimmer light, less work. What they discovered instead was far stranger. Productivity increased regardless of whether the lights were brighter or dimmer. The reason was not the bulbs at all. It was the fact that someone was watching. This is the Hawthorne effect, and it is quietly unsettling. Humans do not act the same when they are observed. Behavior changes. Effort increases. Compliance improves. Even simple awareness that attention is being paid can shift outcomes dramatically. The effect is not conscious either. People rarely think, "I am being observed, so I will work harder." It just happens. The nervous system responds to scrutiny. In the original studies, researchers manipulated various conditions: work hours, rest breaks, pay incentives, even the introduction of new machinery. In almost every case, productivity improved when changes were made, then declined when the attention faded. The lesson was clear. Observation, not the intervention itself, was driving behavior. The shock is in how subtle this effect is. You can be watched without realizing it. Productivity, decision-making, even moral behavior can change simply because the mind senses observation. The brain interprets attention as social evaluation, triggering focus, effort, and self-monitoring. It is as if the nervous system instinctively asks, "Am I meeting expectations? Am I being judged?" Psychologically, this is linked to social facilitation and self-awareness. Humans evolved as social creatures. Reputation and status mattered for survival. When attention is directed at us, conscious or not, the brain reacts by adjusting performance. This is adaptive. In small groups, it ensures cooperation and competence. In modern contexts, it can distort behavior without us noticing. The effect is more profound than productivity. Studies show people behave differently in moral or ethical tasks under observation. Simple acts of honesty increase when participants think they are watched. Even charitable giving rises. Social norms are amplified by the sense of scrutiny. Being observed activates the mind's internal audience. There is also a darker dimension. Constant surveillance can be stressful. The same mechanism that increases effort can erode autonomy, creativity, and authenticity. When behavior is constantly modified by awareness of observation, it may no longer reflect true intentions. People perform rather than act freely. The brain prioritizes approval over genuine choice. The validation here is subtle but universal. If you have ever acted differently when someone was nearby, smiled more, spoke less, hesitated before a decision, adjusted tone or posture, that was the Hawthorne effect at work. You were responding to observation without realizing it. Your behavior was temporarily shaped by the mere presence of an observer. Modern extensions of the Hawthorne effect appear everywhere. Workplace monitoring software, security cameras, fitness apps that track activity. Even social media likes function as a form of observation. Awareness that someone is paying attention triggers effort, adjustment, and sometimes anxiety. The phenomenon is not limited to factories. It permeates daily life. The unsettling insight is this: human behavior is malleable not only by incentives or threats, but by attention itself. Being watched changes who we are in the moment. Our performance, focus, and even morality can shift simply because eyes are on us. This is not imagination. It is built into our nervous system. The Hawthorne effect also challenges assumptions about measurement. If people change when observed, how much of what we measure is real? How much reflects natural behavior? And how much reflects the invisible weight of attention? Experiments, workplaces, even classrooms are all vulnerable to this distortion. As this settles in, The discomfort comes from realizing how little privacy we truly have. Even fleeting attention, perceived or real, alters thought and action. Observation is a subtle force, shaping behavior in ways we rarely notice, yet profoundly feel. The Hawthorne effect does not make people weak or deceptive. It shows how social context and awareness shape human action. And once you understand that simply being watched can change what you do, it becomes impossible to ignore how deeply observation influences every part of life, from the mundane to the moral. The Stanford Dissociation and Identity Experiments. It does not start with forgetting who you are. It starts with feeling slightly unreal. Like you are watching yourself from a step behind. Your body moves, your voice speaks, but something feels off, distant, disconnected. The Stanford Dissociation and Identity Experiments explored that exact space where the mind quietly splits in order to cope. At Stanford, researchers studying dissociation were not looking for drama. They were trying to understand a basic survival mechanism. Dissociation is the brain's way of protecting itself when reality becomes too overwhelming. Instead of fighting or fleeing, the mind detaches, it numbs, it fragments attention, and sometimes it separates identity itself. In controlled experiments, participants were placed in situations involving stress, role immersion, or prolonged cognitive load. Nothing violent, nothing extreme, just enough pressure to push the mind slightly past comfort. Researchers observed how quickly people began to detach from their sense of self. Some participants reported feeling like their actions were automatic, as if they were on autopilot. Others described emotional numbness, as though feelings were muted or switched off. A few experienced depersonalization, the unsettling sensation of not quite being themselves anymore. These effects appeared faster than expected. The shock comes from how ordinary the triggers were. No trauma, no abuse, just sustained stress, authority cues, or immersive roles. The brain did not wait for catastrophe, it adapted preemptively. Neurologically, dissociation occurs when communication between emotional processing regions and self-awareness regions weakens. The brain prioritizes functioning over feeling. This is useful in emergencies. It becomes dangerous when it lingers. The Stanford studies showed how easily that switch can flip. One experiment involved role absorption, where participants were asked to fully inhabit a character or identity for a task. Over time, some began to report confusion about where the role ended and the self resumed. Their speech patterns shifted, their emotional responses aligned with the role. When asked afterward, a few struggled to describe their normal sense of identity. This is not multiple personalities. It is something quieter and more common. Identity thinning, the sense of self becoming less solid under pressure. Another line of research examined dissociation during monotony and isolation. When stimulation dropped and tasks became repetitive, participants reported spacing out, losing time, or feeling detached from their bodies. The mind disconnected not because of fear, but because there was nothing grounding it. The unsettling realization was this: identity is not as fixed as it feels. It is actively maintained by attention, emotion, and context. When those are disrupted, the sense of self loosens. The validation here is deeply human. If you have ever driven somewhere and barely remembered the trip, if you have zoned out during stress and felt emotionally flat, if you have felt like you were watching yourself respond instead of choosing your response, that is dissociation. Mild, temporary, protective. Stanford researchers emphasize that dissociation exists on a spectrum. At one end, it is normal and adaptive. At the other, it becomes pathological. The danger is not dissociation itself. The danger is when it becomes the brain's default state. The experiments also revealed how authority and environment interact with identity. When people are placed in systems where their role matters more than their individuality, dissociation increases. The self steps back, the role steps forward. This reduces internal conflict but also reduces personal agency. This insight echoes across many Stanford studies. When situations overpower self-reflection, identity becomes flexible, sometimes dangerously so. What makes this eerie is how invisible it feels while it is happening. Dissociation does not announce itself. It feels like calm, like distance, like relief. Only later does the cost appear, in memory gaps, emotional blunting, or confusion about what you truly want or feel. The Stanford dissociation experiments do not suggest that identity is fragile. They suggest it is dynamic, maintained moment to moment by connection to emotion, body, and context. When those connections are strained, the mind adapts by stepping back. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from recognizing how often modern life encourages dissociation. Constant stimulation, chronic stress, role pressure. The mind learns to detach just to keep going. These studies do not ask us to fear dissociation. They ask us to notice it. Because once you realize how easily the mind can distance itself from its own experience, you begin to understand that staying present is not automatic. It is an act of maintenance. And in that understanding lies the quiet creepiness. Your sense of self feels solid, until the moment the mind decides it is safer to step away. The emotional contagion studies. You do not need to speak to feel what someone else is feeling. Sometimes all it takes is a look, a tone, or even a few words on a screen. The emotional contagion studies revealed something deeply unsettling about human psychology. Emotions move between people the way viruses do, quietly, automatically, without permission. Researchers first noticed this in face-to-face settings. One person enters a room anxious, tense, or irritated. Minutes later, others begin to feel the same way, even if nothing objectively stressful has happened. The shift feels internal, personal, self-generated. But it is not. It is borrowed. In laboratory experiments, participants were exposed to others displaying specific emotions: happiness, anger, sadness. No explanation was given. No interaction was required. Just proximity or observation. Physiological measures showed changes almost immediately. Heart rate shifted. Facial muscles subtly mirrored what they saw. Mood followed the body. The shock comes from how little awareness people had. When asked why they felt different, participants rarely attributed it to others. They believed the emotion came from within. The mind protects the illusion of independence, even while absorbing the emotional state of the room. This happens through unconscious mimicry. Humans automatically copy facial expressions, posture, and vocal tone of those around them. That mimicry feeds back into the brain. Muscles signal emotion. Emotion becomes feeling. You do not decide to catch it. Your nervous system does it for you. One of the most disturbing demonstrations came from large-scale digital studies. Researchers altered emotional content in social media feeds. Some users saw slightly more positive language. Others saw slightly more negative language. The changes were subtle enough that no one noticed. But moods changed anyway. People exposed to more negative content began posting more negative words themselves. People exposed to positivity became more upbeat. No instructions, no persuasion, just exposure. Emotions spread through screens as easily as they do through rooms. The implication is uncomfortable. You can be emotionally influenced by people you have never met, by crowds, by environments, by algorithms. The feeling still feels like yours. Psychologically, emotional contagion exists because it once served survival. In early human groups, shared emotion meant shared threat awareness. If one person panicked, others needed to respond fast. Empathy and emotional sensing kept groups alive. The system still runs, even when the threat is imaginary or manufactured. The validation here is personal. If you have ever left a conversation feeling drained without knowing why, if someone else's anxiety suddenly became yours, if a single angry person shifted the mood of an entire room, that was emotional contagion, not weakness, not oversensitivity. Biology. The darker side appears when you realize how exploitable this is. Leaders can amplify fear. Media can spread outrage. Workplaces can normalize burnout. Emotional states can be engineered simply by controlling the emotional tone of a space. Another unsettling finding is that negative emotions spread more efficiently than positive ones. Fear, anger, and stress activate attention faster. The brain prioritizes threat signals. One anxious person can outweigh several calm ones. Emotionally, negativity has more weight. The studies also showed that emotional contagion works even when people try to resist it. Telling yourself not to be affected does little. The process happens below conscious thought. By the time awareness arrives, the emotion is already inside you. This raises an eerie question. How many of your moods are actually yours? How many are reflections of the emotional weather around you? The researchers emphasized that emotional contagion does not mean humans lack agency. Awareness helps. Distance helps. Intentional regulation helps. But without awareness, emotions pass through us like currents through water. There is something quietly creepy about that. You can walk into a space feeling fine and leave altered. Not because of what happened to you, but because of what someone else was carrying. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from realizing how porous the mind is, how easily feelings cross boundaries we assume are solid. The self feels private. Emotions feel personal, but they are constantly shaped by others. The emotional contagion studies do not suggest we are puppets. They suggest we are deeply interconnected. Our nervous systems talk to each other, whether we want them to or not. And once you understand that emotions spread silently, invisibly, and automatically, you begin to see every room, every crowd, every screen not just as a place of information, but as a field of influence where feelings move freely, and your mind is never as isolated as it believes. The Stanford pain threshold experiments. Pain does not arrive all at once. It creeps in. A pressure, a heat, a tightening that makes you wonder when it will stop and whether you are still in control. The Stanford pain threshold experiments began in that quiet space, not with screams or extremes, but with a simple question. How much pain can a person tolerate, and what changes that limit? At Stanford, researchers studying pain were less interested in injury and more interested in perception. Pain is not just a signal from the body. It is an experience constructed by the brain. To explore this, participants were exposed to controlled discomfort, heat applied to the skin, cold immersion, sustained pressure. Nothing dangerous, but enough to trigger real pain responses. What shocked researchers was how inconsistent pain tolerance was. Two people exposed to the same stimulus reported wildly different experiences. One tapped out quickly. Another endured far longer. The body was receiving the same signal, but the mind interpreted it differently. Then the deeper layers appeared. When participants were told they had control over the pain, such as the ability to stop it themselves, their tolerance increased. The pain did not lessen in intensity, but it felt more manageable. When control was removed, tolerance dropped sharply. The brain reacted not just to pain, but to helplessness. This revealed a powerful psychological mechanism. Perceived control alters pain processing. The brain's threat system amplifies pain when it feels trapped. When choice exists, even an illusion of it, the nervous system calms slightly. Pain becomes something you are enduring, not something happening to you. Another disturbing finding came from social context. When participants believed others were watching them, especially authority figures or researchers, pain tolerance increased. People endured more discomfort when they felt observed. Not because the pain hurt less, but because quitting felt like failure. This links pain to identity. Endurance became a statement. Stopping felt like weakness. The body suffered to protect the self-image. Stanford researchers also explored expectation. Participants who were told a stimulus would be extremely painful reported higher pain, even when the stimulus was moderate. Those told it would be mild reported less pain under the same conditions. Expectation shaped sensation. Neurologically, this happens because the brain predicts experience before it happens. When pain is expected, the brain prepares threat circuits. Muscles tense. Attention narrows. Sensation intensifies. Pain is not just felt, it is anticipated into existence. The shock deepens when you realize how easily pain can be magnified without changing the body at all. The validation here is personal. If you have ever noticed pain worsen when you panic, if fear made it unbearable, if calm breathing reduced it slightly, that was not imagination. It was your brain modulating sensation in real time. The experiments also uncovered how memory interacts with pain. Participants who remembered pain as worse than it was showed lower tolerance in future trials. Those who remembered it as manageable endured more next time. The brain does not store pain accurately, it stores meaning. This creates a feedback loop. Fearful memory lowers tolerance. Lower tolerance increases distress. Distress intensifies pain. Over time, the threshold drops not because the body weakens, but because the brain learns to expect suffering. One of the most unsettling aspects was how authority influenced pain reports. When a researcher calmly reassured participants that pain was normal and safe, tolerance rose. When uncertainty was introduced, tolerance fell. Trust altered sensation. This has real-world implications: medical pain, chronic illness, childbirth, interrogation, athletic endurance. Pain is never just physical. It is shaped by context, belief, and power dynamics. The Stanford pain threshold experiments did not deny the reality of pain. They showed how flexible it is, how the brain can amplify or dampen it based on meaning rather than damage. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from realizing that pain is not a fixed limit. It is negotiable. Not endlessly, but enough to be influenced by fear, control, expectation, and social pressure. This means pain can be used, manipulated, increased without touching the body, reduced without medication. The same mechanisms that allow resilience can be exploited to cause suffering. The experiments do not suggest you should push through pain. They reveal why pain feels different in different moments, why the same injury hurts more when you are alone, afraid, or powerless. And once you understand that pain lives partly in the mind, the creepiest realization emerges quietly. The boundary between what the body feels and what the brain decides to feel is thinner than it seems. And in that thin space, endurance and suffering are shaped long before the pain ever arrives. The attachment experiments on infant separation. It begins with a baby reaching out and finding nothing there. No familiar arms, no familiar voice. Just absence. The attachment experiments on infant separation started from moments like this, small and quiet, yet emotionally explosive. Researchers were trying to understand something fundamental. What happens to the human mind when the bond it depends on most is suddenly removed? In the mid-20th century, psychologists studying attachment believed that infants bonded primarily for practical reasons: food, warmth, survival. Love was considered secondary. To test this, researchers observed infants and young children placed in controlled separation scenarios. A caregiver would leave the room, sometimes briefly, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes for longer periods. The child was safe, fed, physically unharmed, but emotionally something profound was unfolding. At first, infants protested, crying, reaching, searching the door. This was expected, but what happened next was more disturbing. If the caregiver did not return quickly, many infants stopped crying. They became quiet, still, almost calm. This calm was not relief. Researchers identified 3 stages: protest, despair, detachment. In the protest phase, the infant tries to restore the bond. In despair, energy drops, crying weakens. The child appears withdrawn. In detachment, the infant may seem fine, even playful, but emotionally something has shut down. The shock came from what happened when caregivers returned. Some infants rushed back, clinging desperately. Others avoided eye contact. Some ignored the caregiver entirely. The bond had been strained, and in some cases temporarily severed. Psychologically, this response is a survival mechanism. When connection feels unreliable, the brain adapts by dampening attachment signals. It hurts less to not expect comfort than to keep reaching for it and failing. The infant mind learns a painful lesson early: do not depend too deeply. This is where the experiments cut deep. These reactions happened even when separation was brief and the caregiver was loving. The infant brain does not measure intention, it measures presence. The validation here is quiet but powerful. If you have ever felt distant in relationships, if closeness makes you anxious, if you expect abandonment even without evidence, these patterns often trace back to early attachment disruptions. Not because someone was cruel, but because the bond felt inconsistent. Researchers like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth showed that attachment is not a preference. It is a biological need. The infant nervous system is wired to regulate itself through connection. Heart rate, stress hormones, emotional balance all stabilize through proximity to a caregiver. When that proximity is disrupted repeatedly, the system adapts. Stress responses become heightened or suppressed. Emotional expression changes. Trust becomes conditional. One of the most unsettling findings was how early this learning occurred. Infants too young to speak still encoded these experiences. Their bodies remembered. Long before conscious memory, the nervous system learned what to expect from the world. Later studies followed children with early separation histories. Some became overly clingy, others fiercely independent. Some struggled with emotional regulation. The behaviors looked different, but the root was the same: a nervous system shaped by uncertainty. The experiments also revealed that reunion does not automatically repair the bond. Timing matters, consistency matters, sensitivity matters. When caregivers responded calmly and reliably after separation, attachment could heal. When responses were unpredictable, insecurity deepened. This reframes something important. Attachment styles are not personality flaws. They are adaptations. The child does not choose them. The nervous system builds them to survive the emotional environment it encounters. The creepiness comes from how invisible this process is. No dramatic trauma is required, no obvious abuse, just absence at the wrong moment. Repeated enough times, it reshapes how the mind approaches closeness forever. Modern ethics prevent extreme separation experiments, but their lessons echo everywhere. Hospital stays, institutional care neglect, even emotionally unavailable parenting can create similar patterns. The infant brain does not distinguish between physical absence and emotional unavailability. Both register as separation. As this settles in, the discomfort comes from realizing how foundational attachment is. Before logic, before memory, before identity, the sense of safety is built through another human being. The attachment experiments on infant separation do not accuse parents. They reveal how sensitive early bonds are, how much the mind depends on consistency to feel safe. And once you understand that the earliest separations teach the brain what love feels like, what to expect, and how much to trust, the idea of independence looks different, because beneath every adult relationship lies a very early lesson about whether reaching out will be met with warmth or silence.